Section 1. The Rabbit Hole Beneath the Surface. There is something deeply satisfying about a show that rewards the people paying closest attention. Most animated comedies are content to make you laugh at what is front and center, at the joke that lands, at the punchline that arrives on time. But Family Guy was never really content with that. From its very earliest days, the writers and animators built something into the fabric of almost every episode that most viewers never saw, at least not on the first pass. Maybe not even on the fifth. There were messages buried in background details, references folded into the corners of the frame, little private jokes passed between the creative team, and a small subset of fans patient enough to pause, rewind, and look again. This is the world we are going to spend time in tonight. And I want to be clear about what kind of journey this is going to be. This is not a quick rundown of fun facts. We are not rushing through a listicle. We are going to slow everything down, settle in, and actually explore the strangeness of these hidden details, where they came from, what they mean, why the writers bothered to put them there when most people would never notice. Because the why matters just as much as the what. When you understand why a joke was hidden rather than simply told, you start to understand something real about the people who made the show. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January, 1999. Seth MacFarlane, who was just 25 years old at the time, had spent years working in animation at the Hanna-Barbera Studios, where he contributed to shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He had also created two short animated films, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, which served as direct precursors to the Griffin family dynamic. In those shorts, a man named Larry and his talking dog Steve had the same core relationship that Peter and Brian would later carry into the show proper. MacFarlane took those characters, expanded the world around them, added a wife, 3 kids, and the eccentric neighbors that would populate the Spooner Street block, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in the spring of 1998. Fox gave him the green light. The first episode aired following Super Bowl 33, which meant 22 million people were already sitting on their couches when the Griffins appeared for the very first time. That is one of the most privileged launch pads in the history of American television, and the show made the most of it. But here is the thing that most of those 22 million initial viewers did not know. The writing team MacFarlane assembled was already playing a game with their audience, a quiet, patient, almost mischievous game. They were putting things in the corners of the show that had nothing to do with the main jokes. References so specific they required a particular kind of knowledge to catch. Details so small they required a paused frame to see clearly. And they would keep doing this, season after season, decade after decade, building what is essentially a second layer of comedy running beneath the show that most people watched. Think of it this way. The episode you see is the song. The Easter eggs are the liner notes. And liner notes, by their very nature, are written for a different audience, a more devoted one, a more patient one. The kind of audience willing to do a little extra work because they genuinely love what the artist made. Family Guy, at its best, always seemed to know exactly who it was talking to. There are different kinds of Easter eggs in the show, and they operate on different levels. Some are purely visual things written in the background, things you can only catch if you pause the frame at exactly the right moment. Others are structural, the title of an episode referencing something the episode itself never directly acknowledges. Others are self-referential, the show pointing at its own history, its own flaws, its own running jokes, in ways that reward longtime viewers while sailing completely over the heads of casual ones. And then there are the stranger ones, the coincidences that later turned out to feel almost prophetic, the moments where a throwaway joke quietly predicted something that would happen in the real world years down the line. We are going to work through all of those categories, slowly, carefully, and with as much rich, lingering detail as these moments deserve. Before we go any further, go ahead and get comfortable. Whether you are watching this late at night, early in the morning, or somewhere in between, settle in. There is no rush here. The eggs have been hidden for a long time. They will wait for us to find them at our own pace. And speaking of settling in, if you are enjoying what we are doing here, the single best thing you can do is subscribe. It is completely free. It keeps this kind of content coming. And it means we can keep going deeper, keep finding the things other people walk past. Now, drop a comment before we move on. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are sitting right now. I genuinely love knowing there is something beautiful about the idea of people all over the world listening to this same material in all their different corners of the world, in all their different hours of the day or night. So leave your location and the time, and then settle in, because the first hidden detail in Family Guy goes all the way back to episode 4. Section 2. The early seasons, what was hidden before most people were watching. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy occupy an interesting place in the show's history. They are the seasons most commonly cited as the show's creative peak, the period when the writing was sharpest, the characters most clearly defined, and the whole enterprise operating with the most focused artistic intent. Seth MacFarlane was deeply involved in every frame. He was writing, directing the animation vision, voicing 4 main characters, and steering the show with a level of personal investment that would later become impossible to maintain as his career expanded. What is remarkable, given how tightly controlled those early seasons were, is how many hidden details and secret references the team still found time to pack in. You would think that a small show fighting for its life on a difficult network schedule would not have the bandwidth to be this elaborate. But the animators and writers were doing it anyway, almost compulsively, as if leaving tiny secret messages was simply part of how they thought about their craft. Let us start with one of the very earliest and most discussed hidden details in the entire run of the show. In the episode Love Thy Trophy, which aired during Season 2, there is a moment where baby Stewie Griffin is playing with his building blocks. This is a completely ordinary-seeming scene. Stewie is in the living room, arranged on the floor with his toys, and he is stacking blocks the way babies stack blocks. Except if you look at those blocks very carefully, and I mean very carefully, because the moment passes quickly and the blocks are small in the frame, you can see that Stewie has arranged them to spell out the word red rum, as in the word that young Danny Torrance scrawls on the walls in Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining. Murder spelled backwards. The signal that something dark and violent is pressing in from beyond the walls of ordinary reality. Now, on the surface, this seems like a very simple pop culture reference. Stewie is a baby with murderous intent. Of course, he would spell out the backwards word for murder with his blocks. But the detail is layered in ways that make it richer the longer you sit with it. The Shining is fundamentally about a child who perceives danger that the adults around him cannot see. Danny Torrance knows what is happening in the Overlook Hotel, but his parents do not. Stewie Griffin has plans for Lois Griffin that Lois has never once suspected. The parallel between those two children, both of them carrying dark knowledge in small bodies, surrounded by oblivious adults, is not accidental. The writers chose The Shining specifically because the thematic resonance was so precise. And then there is the extra layer. The blocks are in the frame for only a second or two. Almost no one watching for the first time would catch it. It is a reward for rewatch, for pause and look, for the viewer who trusts the show enough to scrutinize it frame by frame. The animators knew exactly what they were doing. They put in the work to draw that particular arrangement of those particular letters for an audience they were not sure even existed yet. That is a strange kind of faith. Moving forward just slightly to Season 3, there is another hidden gem tucked into an episode called A Fish Out of Water. This one involves the show's use of its own meta-awareness in a way that feels almost impossibly sly for a show that was still relatively young. In a scene where Peter is searching through a TV guide, a magazine that was still genuinely culturally relevant in the early 2000s, the camera briefly catches the cover. And on that cover is a photograph of Luke Perry, the actor best known for his role in Beverly Hills 90210. Below Perry's photograph, if you pause the frame at exactly the right moment, you can read a small caption that says, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air." Just sit with that for a second. The writers buried a message inside a magazine that is inside a scene that is inside an episode of the show, and that message is essentially a direct communication to the most dedicated fans, a wink from the production to the people looking hard enough to find it. If you can read this, meaning if your vision is sharp enough, your attention devoted enough, your DVD player paused at precisely the right second, then you are the kind of viewer who deserves to know that the show exists, that it is still on, that there are people making it who are thinking about you specifically, the one with the pause button, the one leaning forward in your chair. This is one of the defining qualities of early Family Guy's approach to Easter eggs. The hidden details were not just jokes, they were a kind of relationship with the audience. The show was saying, repeatedly and in dozens of different ways, "We see you seeing us." Around this same period, in a brief background moment that many fans did not notice until years later when the show became available on DVD, there is a scene at James Woods Regional High School where Meg and Neil Goldman are working at the school's news studio. The background of that studio, cluttered and alive the way school news sets always are, contains a figure that should not be there at all. Among the students and equipment and generic background characters, there is what appears to be James Woods himself, disguised in Peter's clothing, being followed by a camera crew. James Woods, the real actor, the one the show would make into a recurring character famous for his love of candy, apparently being filmed for something inside the world of the show, dressed as Peter Griffin. It is an impossible detail. It makes no sense in terms of the show's internal logic, and that is exactly the point. The animators put it there as a small, secret acknowledgement of the show's real-world relationship with the actor, a relationship built almost entirely on the fact that the show had been referencing and parodying James Woods for years. Hiding him in the background of this scene, dressed as the show's main character, is a layered joke about how deeply the show had embedded itself in this real person's public identity. Then there is the episode If I'm Dying, I'm Lying, which aired in the middle of Season 1 and which contains one of the most pointed and personal Easter eggs in the entire series. In this episode, Peter is given the remarkable opportunity to bring back any canceled television show of his choosing. He thinks about it. He weighs his options. And then he picks a show called Gumball 2 Gumball. For most viewers, this was simply another odd joke. A show called Gumball 2 Gumball sounds like something the Family Guy writers invented specifically to be absurd. A show built around the brothers of the famous Today Show host Bryant Gumball, presumably in some kind of buddy comedy format. But what makes this moment a genuine Easter egg is what it represents behind the scenes. Gumball 2 Gumball was the actual name of the very first television project that Seth MacFarlane had ever pitched to Fox. Before Family Guy existed, before the Griffins existed, before any of this, Seth MacFarlane walked into a Fox development meeting with a completely different idea, and that idea was called Gumball 2 Gumball. Fox passed on it. The show was never made. So, when Peter Griffin is given the chance to resurrect any canceled show, and he chooses the one that bears the name of Seth MacFarlane's own failed pitch to the network that was currently airing Peter Griffin's adventures, that is not just a joke. That is MacFarlane leaving a personal marking in his own work, the way an artist sometimes hides their initials in the corner of a painting. It is also a very quiet dig at Fox, reminding them through the medium of their own broadcast that they once passed on something from the man who was now one of their most valuable creative assets. The joke has a little edge to it, a little knowing satisfaction. And because it requires outside knowledge to decode, almost nobody watching on the first broadcast would have understood what they were really seeing. There is also an episode in Season 1 called A Hero Sits Next Door, which introduces Joe Swanson for the very first time. Joe arrives as the cool new neighbor, a police officer in a wheelchair who has become something of a local legend for the heroic act that led to his injury. In the background of several scenes in this episode, if you look at the books on the shelves and the papers on the various surfaces in the Swanson household, the decorating choices are unusually specific. The writers and animators put actual thought into what books a man like Joe would own, what photographs he would frame, what the texture of his life would look like in the details around him. It does not matter to the plot. None of it is referenced in dialogue, but it is there, built with care, for the viewer who turns their attention away from the main action for a moment and lets their eyes wander. This is the craft beneath the craft, and early Family Guy was full of it. In Season 2, an episode called Da Boom imagines the world after a Y2K apocalypse. Remember that this show started during the very moment when the entire world was collectively anxious about what would happen when the calendar rolled, from 1999 to 2000. In the chaos of this post-apocalyptic landscape, the show creates visual backgrounds that are crammed with small details, signs that have fallen, buildings with readable text on them, small figures moving through the background of scenes. The animators used the apocalypse setting as an excuse to pack as many hidden references as they could into every wide shot, knowing that the setting itself would encourage viewers to look around at the scenery rather than just tracking the main characters. It is a sophisticated use of genre expectation to create the right conditions for Easter egg delivery. And so even from the very beginning, Family Guy was operating on more than one frequency at the same time. The surface was the comedy, the layer underneath was the conversation. And the layer underneath that was something quieter, still a kind of love letter from the people who made the show to the people who loved it enough to read the fine print. Section 3. Newspaper headlines and the show's secret dialogue with fans. One of the most reliable hiding places in Family Guy and one that the writers returned to again and again across many seasons was the newspaper. In a world where characters occasionally paused to read headlines, where newspapers were handed across counters and dropped on doorsteps and spread across kitchen tables, there was always a second layer of information available to whoever thought to look at the text rather than the action. The most famous of all these newspaper Easter eggs arrives in Season 4, Episode 10, the episode titled Model Misbehavior. This is an episode about Lois discovering a passion for modeling an episode with a reasonably conventional Family Guy plot that moves along at a brisk pace. Near the end, the Griffin family wins a boat race. They make the local newspaper. There is a moment where the paper is held up, displayed to the camera, the Griffin's photograph visible on the front page. And in the lower right corner of that newspaper, in text small enough that you would need to pause the frame and move close to your screen to read it, there is a headline that reads, DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. This is one of the most magnificent pieces of self-awareness in the show's entire run, and it works on several levels simultaneously. First, the literal level. The joke acknowledges that people pause their DVDs to look for hidden jokes in newspaper headlines. The show knows you are doing it. The show has always known you are doing it. And rather than hide an actual joke in the newspaper, it hides a joke about the act of looking for jokes. The headline is the meta-commentary on its own existence. Second, and this is the level that makes the joke even richer, the headline says those people are disappointed. Millions. Disappointed. The joke is that you just did all of that work, all of that pausing and zooming and leaning forward in your chair, and what you found is a notice that you were not going to find anything. The joke eats itself. The Easter egg is an empty Easter egg that tells you it is empty. That particular combination of effort and anticlimax, of expectation and deflation, is structurally comic in a way that takes a moment to fully arrive. Third, there is a genuine warmth underneath the deflation. The show is not mocking the people who pause their DVDs. It is acknowledging them with affection. The fact that they did this at all, that they wrote and animated and placed this specific joke knowing that only a small fraction of the audience would ever find it, is an act of generosity toward exactly the kind of devoted fan they are ostensibly disappointing. They gave a lot of care to the people they were pretending to let down, and this was not the only time the show used a newspaper headline to hold a hidden message. In the pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, there is a brief moment where a newspaper is visible in the background. The headline in the main story relates to the plot of the episode. But the smaller, below-the-fold text, the kind of secondary headline that your eye would pass over in real life too, because the design of the page trains you to look at the most prominent text, first contains an additional gag. This was the very first season. The show was new. The audience had no established expectation of finding hidden material. But the writers were already doing it. Already burying extra jokes in the places most likely to be overlooked. Across the early seasons, the pattern held. Whenever a newspaper appeared on screen, there was a reasonable chance that the secondary text was doing something. Sometimes it was a genuine hidden joke. Sometimes it was a reference to a real news story that would only make sense to someone who was paying attention to the actual world outside the show. Sometimes it was an in-joke about the production, a reference to a writer's room conversation or an inside gag between the animators. The practice became something of a signature. Fan communities developed around cataloging these newspaper details, with members pausing their recordings, zooming in, transcribing the text, and posting it for discussion. This created a feedback loop that the show's writers were well aware of. They knew there was an audience that would look. Knowing that, they had every incentive to make what they hid worth finding. There is a similar tradition at work in the show's use of signs, posters, and written text in the backgrounds of scenes. The background of a Family Guy scene is never accidental. Every sign in a shop window, every poster on a school bulletin board, every label on a product in the Griffin kitchen, These are all opportunities for a second layer of communication that most of the audience will completely miss. In the scene from A Fish Out of Water, where we are briefly inside a library, the spines of the books on the shelves behind the characters are readable if you pause the frame. The titles visible there are not randomly generated library prop text. They are specific. Some are real books. Some are invented titles that serve as quiet jokes. At least one is a reference to something that will not pay off until several episodes later, a rare example of the show using its own background art as foreshadowing. The episode Petarded, from Season 4, is built around the premise that Peter Griffin's IQ is measured as below normal. Specifically, the episode reveals he qualifies as legally, mentally disabled. Within this episode, there are several scenes in medical and official settings, and the paperwork, posters, and signs in those settings all contain text that rewards close attention. The definitions and classifications written on visible documents are accurate to real psychology and medical terminology of the period, but they are deployed with a specificity that suggests someone on the writing staff actually researched them not just enough to get the joke right, but enough to get the background detail right too. The show was not content to get the plot's medical detail correct and then fill the background with generic text. It wanted the background to hold up to scrutiny as well. This level of background detail was not universal across all seasons. As the show continued and the production expanded, as more episodes were being produced every season, as more overseas animation studios became involved, as the direct involvement of the original writing team became more diffuse, the richness of the background detail sometimes thinned. The Easter eggs became less consistent. There were still moments of genuine hidden depth, but they sat alongside episodes where the backgrounds were more generic, more perfunctory, less alive with secret information. But in the early seasons, and in certain landmark episodes even in later years, the newspaper headlines and background signs functioned as a kind of ambient bonus content, a reward for anyone paying attention to the edges of the frame. There is also a fascinating tradition in the show's use of television screens within the fiction. Characters in Family Guy watch a lot of television. This is partly a reflection of the Griffin household's general culture, and partly because it allows the show to insert cutaway gags via the mechanism of a program the characters are watching. But the television screens visible in background shot screens where nobody in the main scene is paying attention to what is playing also occasionally show things that are not referenced in the dialogue. Brief clips, strange images, moments from shows that exist only within the world of Family Guy, or moments from real shows that have been selected and inserted for reasons the episode never explains. These background TV moments are among the hardest Easter eggs to catch, because they are small, they are moving, and they compete for your attention with whatever the main scene is doing. But dedicated fans with the right equipment have paused and examined those screens, and what they have found there suggests a production team that took the background almost as seriously as the foreground. Section 4. The Star Wars Universe and Blue Harvest's Avalanche of Secrets. On the 23rd of September 2007, Family Guy aired the Season 6 premiere, and it was unlike anything the show had done before. The episode was called Blue Harvest. It ran for an entire hour, and it was a complete, feature-length parody of Star Wars. A New Hope, the first film in George Lucas's original trilogy, the one that changed cinema forever when it arrived in the summer of 1977. The episode was made with Lucasfilm's explicit permission. McFarlane's production company had approached Lucasfilm about the idea, and Lucasfilm agreed with one significant condition. The Star Wars characters had to look exactly as they do in the actual films. Not stylized, not abstracted, not filtered through the Family Guy animation style. The Millennium Falcon had to look like the Millennium Falcon. Darth Vader's helmet had to look like Darth Vader's helmet. The lightsabers, the uniforms, the environments, all of it had to match the real films as closely as animation allowed. This condition turned Blue Harvest into something extraordinary. It meant that the Family Guy production team had to study the source material with an almost forensic level of attention, which in turn gave them the tools and the motivation to pack the episode with more hidden references to Star Wars lore than most casual fans would ever be able to identify. The title itself was the first Easter egg, and it was a deep one. Blue Harvest was the real-world cover name that Lucasfilm used during the production of Return of the Jedi. When they were filming that movie in the early 1980s, George Lucas and his team were deeply concerned about security. The Star Wars franchise had grown enormous since A New Hope, and they knew that if the world found out a Star Wars sequel was being filmed, the locations would be overrun with photographers, set visitors, and journalists. To protect the production, they created a fake film called Blue Harvest, pitched as a low-budget horror film with the tagline, "Horror Beyond Imagination," and all the crew wore Blue Harvest t-shirts, and the entire production was conducted under that name. Most viewers watching the Family Guy episode on its premiere night had no idea any of this was true. To them, Blue Harvest was a strange, slightly ominous title for a cartoon Star Wars parody. But for the Star Wars fans who knew the production history, and there are many, many people who know Star Wars production history, the way some people know scripture, the title was an immediate signal that the people making this episode were serious, that they had done the deep reading, that they were not just making notes about lightsabers and Wookiees. They were engaging with the myth of Star Wars all the way down to its production secrets. Within the episode itself, the layers continued to accumulate. One of the earliest and most visually elaborate hidden details involves the opening shot. The iconic opening of Star Wars, the one where the Rebel blockade runner is chased by an impossibly large Star Destroyer that fills the screen from below in a shot that was almost physically overwhelming to audiences in 1977, is reproduced in the Family Guy version with tremendous care. But on that Star Destroyer, if you are looking at the background, you can see a small bumper sticker attached to the ship's hull. The bumper sticker reads, "Bush, Cheney 04. A campaign sticker from the 2004 American presidential election applied to an Imperial Star Destroyer, representing the Empire's political affiliations in the world of the parody. This is the kind of detail that rewards multiple viewings for multiple reasons. On the first watch, you might miss it entirely. On the second, you notice it and get the joke. The Empire, as the Bush administration, is a classic piece of left-leaning political satire. And in 2007, when this aired, the Bush administration was still in power, so the joke had genuine bite. On the third watch, you start thinking about the specific choice of bumper sticker rather than just a generic political image, and the precision of choosing the re-election campaign specifically, the 04 sticker, suggests that the Empire won its own re-election, that the dark side of the Force had successfully campaigned for a second term. Inside the Mos Eisley Cantina sequence, the scene where Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi first encounter Han Solo in the original film, the Family Guy version stuffs the background with characters who have no business being there. Some of these are Star Wars creatures, matching the aliens and freaks who populated the cantina in the actual film. But several of the figures sitting in the shadows and along the walls are characters from other animated shows. Roger, the extraterrestrial from McFarlane's own American Dad, is there. Bender, the foul-tempered robot from Matt Groening's Futurama, is there, even though his presence technically violates the cantina's no droids policy, a fact the episode actually acknowledges in a brief note in the background text. Coach John McGurk from the Adult Swim show Home Movies is there. And in one corner, the evil monkey from Chris Griffin's closet, a recurring visual gag from Family Guy itself, has found its way into a galaxy far, far away. These background cameos operate on several different levels. The most immediate is pure comic surprise, the delight of recognizing a character who has no reason to be in this place at all. But the second level is about the relationships between these shows, these creative worlds, these networks of animated comedy that were all operating in the same cultural space in the mid to late 2000s. Bender from Futurama and Roger from American Dad showing up in the cantina is a kind of affectionate acknowledgement that all of these shows, all of these weird, adult-oriented, boundary-pushing animated comedies were part of the same extended family. They were the aliens in the same bar. They were all doing the same strange thing in the same weird corner of American entertainment. The evil monkey being there adds another layer still. That character had, at this point, appeared in many Family Guy episodes as a simple recurring visual joke, the mysterious figure in Chris's closet who pointed at him accusingly. Inserting the evil monkey into the Blue Harvest cantina was a way of giving the character a kind of expanded identity, suggesting that the evil monkey's strangeness was not limited to the Griffin household, that the creature simply moved through the world, pointing at things with accusatory intent wherever the world placed it. It was a joke about the joke, a commentary on the character's own nature via its impossible presence in another story entirely. The episode also contains what is perhaps the most sophisticated cinematic reference hidden within a sight gag in the entire show's run. In the scene where Luke watches the twin sunset of Tatooine, one of the most famous and visually iconic moments in all of Star Wars, a moment scored with John Williams' sweeping main theme and designed to communicate the longing and potential of a young man staring toward his future, the Family Guy version begins playing the actual music. Luke, played here by Chris Griffin, stares at the twin suns. The melody swells, and then Luke turns to the camera and introduces the composer. John Williams appears not animated, but represented along with the London Symphony Orchestra, who are physically present behind him on the plains of Tatooine, having apparently been there the whole time playing the score. This is itself a reference to a scene from Mel Brooks's 1974 comedy Blazing Saddles, where the Count Basie Orchestra appears in the middle of the desert for no reason. But the Family Guy version adds an additional layer. When Luke later finds his uncle and aunt murdered, he discovers that John Williams and the entire London Symphony Orchestra have also been killed. The rest of the episode, Luke Laments, will have to be scored by Danny Elfman instead, and he decapitates Danny Elfman with his lightsaber in apparent rage. This joke requires you to know: Star Wars is famous for its John Williams score. Blazing Saddles is famous for its desert orchestra scene. Danny Elfman is a real film composer associated with a completely different aesthetic than Star Wars. And the juxtaposition of these three specific references, layered on top of each other in the space of about 30 seconds, is either a masterclass in pop culture comedy or an elaborate noise that sounds like comedy to people who recognize all the pieces. Depending on how many of those references you carry with you, it lands differently. For someone who knows all three, it is deeply funny. For someone who knows none of them, it is simply John Williams and some orchestra dying on a desert planet. The joke exists in multiple versions simultaneously, one for each level of knowledge the viewer brings. During the film's Death Star assault sequence, when the rebel pilots are receiving their target coordinates and the plan is being explained, the Family Guy version includes a briefing video presented by basketball legend Magic Johnson. There is no narrative reason for Magic Johnson to be in this video. There is no punchline that follows the reveal. The joke is entirely that Magic Johnson is there, that he is the one explaining how to blow up the Death Star, that someone in the Rebel Alliance decided Magic Johnson was the right person for this particular briefing. But buried within the selection of Magic Johnson specifically is an additional layer. Magic Johnson famously appeared in educational videos in the early 1990s, particularly related to health and HIV awareness. The selection of Magic Johnson as the educational video host is a specific reference to that real-world cultural context, tying the Star Wars universe to a very specific chapter in Magic Johnson's public life. The joke is not just random celebrity placement. It is celebrity placement chosen for its associations. And then there is the detail that only viewers who had been following Family Guy since the very beginning could fully appreciate. When the episode ends and Peter has finished telling the story of Star Wars to his assembled family, the framing device being that the power went out and Peter occupied the family's time by retelling the movie Chris, Griffin speaks up. He points out that Robot Chicken, a stop-motion animation show on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block, had already done a Star Wars parody well before Family Guy got around to it. He says this in a tone of mild reproach, as if he considers the Family Guy Star Wars parody slightly derivative by virtue of arriving second. The joke is that Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, is also the co-creator, executive producer, and primary creative force behind Robot Chicken. Seth Green was, at the time of this episode's broadcast, literally the person responsible for the Robot Chicken Star Wars special. And so the joke is built on the real-world identity of the voice actor colliding with the fictional identity of the character he is voicing, Chris Griffin, criticizing Family Guy for doing something Robot Chicken already did, while being voiced by the man who made the thing Robot Chicken already did. The layers of self-referential awareness required to fully appreciate this moment are extraordinary. You need to know who voices Chris Griffin. You need to know what Robot Chicken is. You need to know who makes Robot Chicken. And then you need to hold all of that simultaneously while a cartoon character criticizes his own show for creative timing. Family Guy made 2 sequels to Blue Harvest something, something, something. Darkseid in 2009, which parodied The Empire Strikes Back, and It's a Trap in 2010, which parodied Return of the Jedi. Each of these contained their own hidden layers. Something, something, something. Darkseid's title is itself a reference to an earlier episode of Family Guy, specifically a cutaway gag featuring Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader, during which Palpatine explains that he has cracked the code for writing Star Wars dialogue. Something, 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 Darkseid. Something, 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 complete. The episode title is therefore already an Easter egg for devoted fans who remembered that specific cutaway from 2 seasons earlier. It's a Trap, meanwhile, whose title is a deliberate reference to Admiral Akbar's famous line in Return of the Jedi, a line that had by 2010 already become one of the most quoted moments in all of Star Wars. An internet meme before people use that word for everything contains within it a meta-awareness that the producers seem almost tired of the whole project. Characters within the episode break the fourth wall to complain about making a third parody special. The episode acknowledges its own diminishing returns in real time. But even in this act of complaint and self-deprecation, there are layered references for those who know where to look. Section 5. Crossover Easter eggs and the collisions between fictional universes. One of the great pleasures of long-running animated shows is the occasional collision between fictional worlds, the crossover episode, the cameo from a character who has no business being in this story, the quiet acknowledgement that the universes these shows inhabit might share some kind of border. Family Guy has always been unusually interested in these collisions. Part of it is the show's fundamental nature as a cultural reference machine, a show that defined itself from the beginning by its relationship to other pieces of popular culture. When your primary comedy mode is reference and parody, the boundary between your world and every other fictional world you are referencing necessarily becomes porous. Things leak through. Characters wander in from adjacent stories. Universes acknowledge each other. But Family Guy's crossover Easter eggs are more interesting than simple winks at other shows. They tend to have thought behind them. They tend to be chosen because the choice reveals something about the shows involved, about their cultural relationships, about the people making Family Guy, and how they see themselves in the landscape of animated comedy. The most significant crossover in the show's history, from a pure Easter egg density standpoint, is the 2014 episode The Simpsons Guy, a 1-hour special that brought the Griffin family into direct contact with the Simpsons family for the first time in the show's shared history on Fox. The episode is layered with hidden details that reward close attention, and many of them operate as quiet jokes about the real-world relationship between the two shows, a relationship that had always been complicated. The most famous of these is a moment that requires you to know the show's respective Emmy Award histories. During a climactic fight scene between Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson, a scene structured to mirror Peter's recurring battles with the giant chicken, Homer begins throwing Emmy statuettes at Peter. He throws them one after another and they land hits. Peter reaches for something to throw back and finds nothing. He does not have any Emmys. The Simpson family has won 31 Primetime Emmy Awards as of this writing. Family Guy has won 0. This is a very specific piece of self-deprecation, and what makes it work as an Easter egg rather than a simple joke is that it requires outside knowledge to fully land. If you do not know the show's Emmy histories, the scene is still funny. 2 cartoon men throwing things at each other is inherently comedic. But if you know that the Emmys are a precise representation of the real-world critical reception divide between the two shows, the scene becomes something darker and more interesting. Family Guy acknowledging, through comedy, that the show it has always been compared to, and occasionally mocked, has received a form of institutional recognition that it has not. It is worth noting that this moment was written and produced. This is Family Guy choosing to make this joke about itself, choosing to draw attention to its own lack of Emmy recognition in a crossover episode that was already drawing attention to all the ways it is different from, and sometimes lesser than, The Simpsons. That is a peculiar kind of confidence. The show is secure enough in its own identity and its own fan base to acknowledge a measure of cultural inferiority while also being funny about it. That is a harder thing to do than it looks. During the same episode, Roger from American Dad briefly appears on screen. He is present for only a few seconds. He says almost nothing of consequence, and then he leaves. This cameo is structured very carefully to reference the fact that American Dad, which had been airing alongside both shows on Fox for years, had by this point been moved off Fox entirely and was now airing on TBS. Roger's brief appearance and equally brief departure is a quiet acknowledgement of that transition, a visual representation of the fact that the American Dad character no longer belonged in the Fox animated lineup, that he was a visitor from somewhere else now, passing through on his way back to wherever he had ended up. This is an unusually sophisticated use of a background character. Roger does not need to be in the episode at all. His presence adds nothing to the plot. But his presence and his immediate exit encode an entire narrative about the business side of television, about which shows belong where, about what it means to no longer be part of a network family. All of that is communicated in about 5 seconds of screen time, for an audience that would only understand the joke if they already knew the American Dad backstory. There is also a subtler Simpsons reference built into the fight scene's choreography that most viewers missed on the initial broadcast. The fight between Peter and Homer is staged to mirror, beat for beat, the structure of a specific style of action sequence that The Simpsons had frequently used in its own episodes. The way the camera moves during the fight, the way impacts are staged, the rhythm of the violence, these are borrowed from the visual grammar of The Simpsons, not from Family Guy's own aesthetic. The fight scene looks slightly different from how Family Guy normally stages action because it is being filtered through an imitation of how The Simpsons would stage action. The crossover is not just between the characters. It is between the animation styles, the visual languages of the two shows. And that is a detail that most people would only notice if they had spent time studying both shows closely enough to feel the difference when one briefly inhabits the other's grammar. Looking further back, there is a recurring tradition in Family Guy of including background characters who belong to other fictional worlds. The cantina scene in Blue Harvest, which we discussed at length in the previous section, is the most elaborate version of this. But smaller, quieter versions appeared throughout the show's run. In several scenes set at Quahog's various bars and social venues, background characters with distinctive designs that match the visual style of other animated shows have turned up. Some of these are documented and verified. Others remain genuinely ambiguous, the kind of background character who might be a specific reference, or might simply be a background character who happens to have a similar design to something else. The ambiguity is itself interesting. When a detail is ambiguous, it invites the viewer to bring their own knowledge to it, to decide whether they are seeing a reference or a coincidence. The show, in those moments, becomes a Rorschach test of pop culture knowledge. The tradition of Family Guy, including characters from its sister show American Dad in background moments, runs throughout the series. Because both shows were McFarlane Productions airing on the same network for most of their runs, there was a fluid relationship between their fictional universes. Characters from American Dad would occasionally appear in the background of Family Guy scenes without comment. Characters from Family Guy would be referenced within American Dad in similarly understated ways. This was partly a practical matter. The same animation team worked on both shows at certain points, and characters who were already drawn and rigged were available to use in crowd scenes and background shots. But it was also a deliberate creative choice, a way of suggesting that these two fictional American towns existed in the same extended world. The most pointed version of this comes in several episodes where Barry Robinson, one of the more recognizable secondary characters from American Dad, a rotund neighbor of the Smiths, appears in the background of Family Guy scenes without any character from the main cast acknowledging him. He is simply there, in the crowd, recognizable to American Dad viewers and invisible to everyone else. When an episode of Family Guy sends Peter to a weight loss camp, Barry Robinson is among the other participants. The joke is available only to someone watching both shows closely enough to recognize him. To everyone else, he is simply a round man in the background of a weight loss scene. The 2014 Simpsons crossover also includes a moment in the courtroom scene, where the legal fate of a fictional beer is being decided, where many familiar characters from both shows are visible in the gallery. Sitting among the Springfieldians and the Quahogians are characters who belong to neither town, background figures from other Fox animated shows, long-canceled characters from shows that were already gone by 2014. The courtroom in this reading is not just a courtroom, it is a kind of museum of animated Fox history, a space where all the shows that had lived on that network could gather for one collective moment before dispersing again into their separate continuities. There is a poignancy to that, if you are willing to feel it. All those characters from all those shows, most of which no one remembers now, sitting together in a courtroom debating which beer is better. It is a very strange form of animation history. Section 6. The Evil Monkey and the Hidden Depth of Running Gags. The evil monkey, who lives in Chris Griffin's closet, is one of the most interesting characters in the entire history of Family Guy, not because of what he is, but because of what he represents as a structural device. And because of the secret depth that the show gradually, quietly built into him over many seasons before most viewers had any idea. On the surface, the evil monkey is a simple running joke. Chris has a monkey in his closet, the monkey is evil. Every time Chris mentions the monkey, the rest of the family laughs it off or ignores it, treating it as an obvious delusion. Occasionally, the monkey himself appears peeking out from the closet, pointing at Chris with what is clearly accusatory intent, his face arranged in a genuinely menacing expression. Chris reacts with fear. Everyone else sees nothing. This is the whole joke, and it repeats across many seasons. But the joke has layers that most people never noticed. The evil monkey is a reference to childhood anxiety about what lives in the darkness of closets, a fear that is so universal, so deeply embedded in the experience of being a child, that there is an entire Pixar film essentially built around it. Children's closets are the place where the impossible lives, the thing that adults will not acknowledge. The fear that exists in the space between the world children experience and the world adults say is real. Chris's monkey is, in that reading, the show's externalizing of a specific emotional truth about childhood, the knowledge that there are things adults refuse to see, that children are not believed when they report what the darkness contains. This is funny, and it is also not entirely funny. The best running gags in long-running shows often contain this quality. They operate as comedy on the surface, and as something more complicated underneath. And the show rarely calls attention to the deeper layer because doing so would collapse the tension that makes the surface layer work. But then the show did something unexpected. In the episode Hannah Banana from Season 8, it was revealed that the evil monkey had backstory, actual specific backstory. It turned out that the monkey had once been a normal monkey, not evil at all, who had been driven to his current state of menacing intent by a specific personal tragedy. His wife had cheated on him. He had come home to find her with another monkey. The betrayal broke something in him. He became the pointing, scowling, closet-dwelling creature that had been tormenting Chris because the most fundamental relationship of his life had collapsed and he had never recovered from it. This revelation fundamentally recontextualizes every single previous appearance of the evil monkey. Every time he peeked out from that closet and pointed at Chris, he was not simply being evil for the sake of evil. He was a creature made of grief and betrayal, and the accusatory pointing gesture, which the show had always played as simple menace, was actually the behavior of someone who had lost the ability to connect with the world in any other way. He pointed because pointing was what he had left. He frightened because frightening was the only form of relationship he still knew how to have. This is an extraordinary piece of retroactive character work, hidden inside a joke that had been running for 7 seasons. Most viewers who had been watching since the beginning had developed a complete understanding of the evil monkey as a comedic device, a reliable source of a specific kind of humor that the show could return to whenever it needed a certain beat, and then the show reached back into all of those accumulated moments and added a dimension to them that made them mean something different, without removing what they had originally meant. The episode also includes an additional layer. The evil monkey eventually leaves the Griffin household after being shown kindness, implying that what he needed all along was simply to be treated as a person, as a creature with a history and feelings, rather than as a threatening background presence. The joke resolves in its way into a story about what happens when you see the history behind menace and choose to respond with empathy rather than fear. That is a genuinely strange place for a running gag to end up. But the show did not fully abandon the evil monkey mythology after this episode. He later turns up in the Blue Harvest Cantina, as we discussed. He also makes background appearances in other contexts, usually in crowd scenes or in background shots, where his presence is technically unexplained by the episode's main narrative. His trajectory from simple, scary background joke to sympathetically explained character to recurring background presence in unrelated contexts is one of the stranger hidden arcs in the show's history. There are other running gags in Family Guy that have similar hidden depth, though most of them are less dramatically revealed than the evil monkeys. Mayor Adam West, played by the late actual Adam West, the man who portrayed Batman in the 1960s television series, appears throughout the show as the mayor of the fictional town where the Griffins live. On the surface, Mayor West is simply a joke about Adam West, a reference to his Batman legacy, played with gentle affection for a man who had gamely committed to the bit of being a comedic reference to his own iconic role. The real Adam West voiced the character himself, and there was always something touching about the way he embraced the role. A man who had spent years being defined by a performance from the 1960s, finally finding a context in which that definition became its own source of joy rather than limitation. But Mayor Adam West, across many episodes, accumulated a body of behavior that went beyond simple celebrity reference jokes. He developed genuine, consistent character traits. He had specific obsessions and fears. He had relationships with other characters that evolved over time. He was, in a quiet way, one of the most consistently written recurring characters in the show's history, a character who started as a reference and became, gradually, a presence. The show used him for jokes about the absurdity of local government, about the particular kind of eccentric power that small-town mayors can accumulate, about the way celebrity can outlive its original context and become something new. His death, Adam West, the real person, died in June 2017, and the show's subsequent handling of Mayor West required genuine decisions about how to continue. The character was treated with genuine care. The show eventually acknowledged the mayor's death within the fiction, in a way that allowed the episode to be both a joke and a proper memorial. This kind of dual-purpose comedy and genuine feeling coexisting is exactly the kind of thing that requires the kind of accumulated history and character depth that Mayor Adam West had developed over many seasons of what had ostensibly been a simple running gag. Herbert the Pervert is another recurring background character who accumulated more depth than his surface presentation suggested. Herbert is one of the more uncomfortable figures in the show's history, an elderly man who expresses inappropriate romantic interest in young boys, with the primary target of this interest being Chris Griffin. The character is played as comedy, and this is one of the more legitimately criticized aspects of the show's humor. The use of predatory behavior as a source of recurring laughs sits uneasily against the show's occasional handling of similar topics as serious subjects in different episodes. But setting aside the ethical complications for a moment, and looking only at the structural Easter egg dimension of the character Herbert has, embedded within him, a backstory that is revealed in fragments across many episodes. Specifically, there are repeated hints and occasional direct statements that Herbert served in World War II, that he was a young soldier who fell in love with another young soldier during the war, and that this relationship never consummated, ending in tragedy. Buried beneath decades of life is the source of everything strange about him. His current behavior is, in this reading, a distorted echo of a genuine emotional experience that was made impossible by the historical moment in which it occurred. This backstory does not excuse or sanitize anything about the character, but it exists, placed there by writers who apparently felt that even their most uncomfortable recurring character should have an emotional history, should be more than a simple joke machine. The hidden depth of Herbert's backstory is not played for laughs when it appears. It is played in those brief moments with genuine sorrow. And then the show moves on and he is a joke again. Section 7. Meta jokes about the show's own existence. Family Guy has always been a show that is aware of itself, sometimes uncomfortably so. But across many seasons, this self-awareness produced some of the most genuinely surprising hidden jokes in the show's catalog. Moments where the writers folded the show's own history, reputation, and internal contradictions into the fabric of episodes in ways that rewarded only the most attentive and knowledgeable viewers. Some of the best examples of this are built around the show's complicated relationship with The Simpsons. From the very beginning, Family Guy existed in a cultural shadow of comparison to the earlier show, both animated comedies about blue-collar American families with a specific relationship to beer and television, both airing on Fox, both building their humor around the dysfunctions of a particular American household. The comparison was inevitable, and it was often made by people who considered it dismissive Family Guy as The Simpsons but cruder, faster, less interested in character. Whether that comparison was fair or not, it shaped the cultural conversation around both shows for many years. Family Guy's response to this comparison was to acknowledge it. repeatedly and explicitly, in ways that ranged from defensive to self-deprecating to deeply funny. In one particularly celebrated meta moment, Peter Griffin arrives home after an evening out and collapses onto his bed. In a state of tired, half-awake confession, he murmurs to himself, "We act like we didn't take a lot from The Simpsons, but we took a lot from The Simpsons." This line lands differently depending on when you first encounter it. Watching it for the first time, in the context of the episode, it is simply a surprising bit of self-awareness from a character who is not normally given to self-awareness. It is funny because Peter is admitting something, but if you have been following the public discourse around the two shows, the comparisons, the arguments, the interviews where people on both sides have been more or less candid about their feelings, the line takes on additional meaning. It is the show speaking, through Peter's mouth, directly to its own critics. It is an acknowledgement that cannot be used against the show, because the show has already used it against itself. The episode Back to the Pilot, which we will discuss at greater length in a later section, contains a moment where Stewie and Brian, having traveled back to the events of the very first episode, observe the original Griffin family pausing mid-scene for a cutaway gag. The 1,999 Griffins simply stop moving during the cutaway. They stand frozen, waiting for the joke to finish, suspended in animation while something unrelated to them plays out. Stewie, watching from 2011, observes this and says something to the effect that they just stand there, that there is nothing for them to do during the cutaway, that they are just frozen, waiting. This is Family Guy doing something genuinely self-critical, acknowledging through the mechanism of time travel the critique that the South Park episode Cartoon Wars had made 5 years earlier, that cutaway gags removed the characters from the story and left them with nothing to do, that they were interchangeable and disconnected from narrative. The show is using one of its own most creative episodes to admit that one of its own most characteristic comedy techniques has a structural problem, and it does this while still using cutaway gags elsewhere in the same episode. The episode Cutaway Land, which had the show explicitly examine its own most famous tool, contains what might be the most concentrated cluster of meta Easter eggs in the entire run. In this episode, Peter and Lois discover they can physically enter the world of Family Guy cutaway gags, moving from one random scene to another, as if traveling between rooms. The episode should be a celebration of the cutaway format. It is also, accidentally or intentionally, a fairly devastating demonstration of that format's limitations. The cutaway world is revealed to be repetitive, incoherent, and populated by recycled material from earlier in the show's history. The episode ends with Peter waking up and discovering the whole thing was a dream. That ending is simultaneously the most cliched and least imaginative conclusion to a story involving time travel to a magical animated space. And the episode seems to know this. Characters comment on how tired that ending is. The self-awareness does not save the episode from using the tired ending anyway, which is itself a kind of meta-comment on what happens when a show knows its own problems without being able to solve them. There is also a long tradition in Family Guy of jokes that reference the show's actual voice cast, using the gap between the real actors and the characters they voice as a source of hidden comedy. The most elaborate version of this involves Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin and who is also the co-creator of Robot Chicken. Within Family Guy, Robot Chicken is repeatedly mocked and dismissed. Peter Griffin, in particular, expresses contempt for the show. He calls it cheap, uninteresting, not worth his time. He does this while being voiced by Seth MacFarlane, who clearly has some competitive feelings about a show that does the kind of pop culture parody work that Family Guy also does. But Chris Griffin, voiced by Seth Green, is never shown to share Peter's contempt for Robot Chicken. In fact, in the Blue Harvest episode, Chris is the one who points out that Robot Chicken did the Star Wars parody first. Chris defends Robot Chicken against Peter's dismissal, using Robot Chicken knowledge that Peter does not have. For the viewer who knows that Seth Green makes Robot Chicken, this is a rich exchange. The show has arranged things so that the character voiced by Robot Chicken's creator is the one who defends Robot Chicken, while the character who dismisses Robot Chicken is voiced by someone with obvious rivalry feelings about the show. All of the real-world dynamics between these two production companies and their creative heads are encoded into the fictional dynamics between Peter and Chris Griffin, legible to anyone with the right external knowledge. Similarly, there are moments scattered throughout the series where the show acknowledges the careers and public personas of the actors who voice its characters in ways that only pay off if you know those careers. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, also had a prominent role in the Amazon series The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. In certain later episodes, there are background references, throwaway lines, visible text, brief visual jokes that acknowledge Maisel in a way that links directly to Borstein's presence in both productions. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg Griffin since season 2, had a high-profile film career, including Bad Moms and its sequel. The show contains quiet references to these films as well, never foregrounding them, always embedding them in the background of scenes where someone looking for them would find them and someone not looking would miss them entirely. The practice of embedding references to cast members' outside careers creates a secondary text running beneath the primary one, a show within the show, visible only to the audience who follows both Family Guy and the wider careers of the people who make it. This is a very specific kind of insider humor, the kind that rewards genuine fandom rather than casual viewership. It treats the most devoted audience members as having earned access to a layer of the show that everyone else doesn't get. There is also a recurring tradition of the show making jokes about Fox, the network that has broadcast Family Guy since its inception. These jokes are sometimes broad, Peter making a dismissive reference to another Fox show, characters pointing out the network's programming choices. But the more interesting version is the kind of joke that encodes specific knowledge about the business relationship between the show and the network into what appears to be ordinary dialogue or background detail. Seth MacFarlane's public frustrations with Fox, particularly his discomfort with the network's association with Fox News, which he made explicit in a 2021 social media post, were an open secret in the entertainment industry long before they became public statements. And within the show itself, across many seasons, there are jokes whose full meaning requires awareness of this tension. A line about feeling trapped in a bad situation, a reference to wanting to be somewhere else, a moment where a character makes a business decision that echoes, at a very oblique angle, the specific nature of a long-running contractual relationship that no longer feels entirely aligned with one's values. These jokes are not hidden in the traditional Easter egg sense. They are not buried in the background of a frame where you would only find them with a pause button. They are in the dialogue, in the storylines. But they require context to decode, and without that context, they are simply jokes. The context is the Easter egg. Section 8. When Family Guy hid real people in plain sight? There is a specific and slightly strange tradition in Family Guy of including real people in ways that are not always immediately obvious, not as the prominent guest stars who appear in many episodes and are announced in the credits, but as hidden presences, background figures, names embedded in documents, faces visible for a frame or two in circumstances that the episode never explains. Some of these hidden real people are the animators and writers themselves. The tradition of putting production staff into crowd scenes goes back to the earliest days of animation. It is a form of self-portrait, the artists inserting themselves into the world they are creating. In Family Guy, this tradition has produced some interesting specific moments. In the season 11 episode, Friends Without Benefits, there is a background scene at the Griffin household where a crowd of characters passes through. Among them, if you look carefully at the faces and cross-reference them with photographs of the Family Guy writing staff, several real members of the production team are present. One of the most specifically noted is an animated version of a writer named Steve Callahan, whose likeness appears as a background character in a party scene with recognizable enough features that multiple viewers independently identified him before anyone from the production confirmed the detail. This kind of hidden self-portrait serves as both a reward for very close attention and a form of internal team humor. When you work on a show for many years, the inside jokes accumulate. Putting yourself or your colleagues into the background of an episode is a way of making those years visible, of leaving a mark on the work that most of the audience will never see, but that the people who know will always know is there. There is a similar tradition with the producers. Cherry Sheva-Pravat-Dumring, who has been a producer on Family Guy for many years, has her name embedded in background text in several episodes specifically, according to fan documentation. In an episode during season 11 where the name appears in the background of a scene in a news studio, the name is unusual enough that it stands out when you notice it. but the name's significance that it belongs to a real person who works on the show is only available to people who know the production staff. James Woods presents one of the most elaborate examples of a real person being hidden in plain sight across the entire run of the show. The real James Woods, the Oscar-nominated actor known for his intense performances in films like Salvador and Casino, became, over many years of Family Guy, a character within the show's fiction. His relationship with the show began with simple jokes at his expense, moved through an ongoing bit about his weakness for candy, the idea being that he could be lured anywhere by leaving a trail of sweets, and eventually became a recurring story arc in which the fictional version of James Woods became a genuine recurring antagonist. The moment where the real James Woods became genuinely entangled with the fictional version was the episode where the fictional Woods disguises himself as Peter Griffin and is spotted by fans in the background of a school news program. The episode does not explain what the fictional James Woods was doing there, dressed as the show's main character, being followed by a camera crew. It simply places him there, in the background, for the viewer to notice. The joke exists on the boundary between the show's internal fiction and its external cultural references, in a space that requires the viewer to hold both simultaneously. The show also has a tradition of hiding real products and real brands in ways that are not technically product placement but function as a kind of cultural documentation, a snapshot of what existed in the world when these episodes were made. The specific brands of beer that appear on the bar counter at the Drunken Clam have changed over the years to reflect what was actually available and popular during each production period. The technology visible in the Griffin household, the televisions, the computers, the phones, updates in ways that track real-world technological change with fairly precise fidelity. A viewer who studied the background of Family Guy episodes in chronological order would get a reasonably accurate account of how consumer technology evolved in American households over roughly 25 years. There is also an episode-specific hidden real-person detail that has entered Family Guy lore in the episode North by North Quahog. When a car belonging to Jesus Christ appears on screen, the license plate reads WWID. This is a play on the phrase WWJD, what would Jesus do? Adjusted to represent what the actual first-person Jesus might ask himself. What would I do? The joke requires knowledge of the WWJD cultural phenomenon, which was at its peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s as a component of evangelical youth culture in the United States. For someone who grew up in that cultural moment, the license plate joke is immediately legible and immediately funny. For someone without that context, it is simply a strange license plate on a car belonging to Jesus. Section 9. The Uncanny Predictions Accidents That Became Reality. One of the most consistently surprising aspects of Family Guy's long run is the number of times the show has made a throwaway joke, a cutaway gag, a background detail, a piece of offhand dialogue that later turned out to align with something that actually happened in the real world. Some of these alignments are loose enough that they require significant interpretive generosity to qualify as predictions. Others are specific enough that the word coincidence feels genuinely insufficient. The most famous is also the most uncomfortable to discuss, and it involves a moment from the 4th season episode Don't Make Me Over, which aired in 2005. In this episode, during a scene at a shopping mall, baby Stewie Griffin is running naked through the crowd in a state of obvious terror. He is screaming. He is screaming specifically that he has just escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. In 2005, this was a joke built on a rumor that had been circulating about Kevin Spacey, a rumor involving a dog park and an unnamed accusation that was never verified and remained in the category of gossip rather than established fact. Seth MacFarlane has been very direct in interviews about this. The joke was not his, he said. Someone else on the writing staff brought it to the room, the network allowed it given the circulating gossip, and MacFarlane allowed it to air. He did not write it and was not deeply attached to it. 12 years later, in October 2017, Anthony Rapp came forward publicly with allegations that Kevin Spacey had made inappropriate sexual advances toward him when Rapp was 14 years old in 1986. Rapp's account opened the door for numerous other men to come forward with accounts of their own, spanning many years and involving behavior that was, in many cases, significantly more serious than the dog park rumor had suggested. Kevin Spacey's career effectively ended, and the Stewie basement joke, which had been a relatively obscure piece of Family Guy trivia for over a decade, suddenly became very widely known. The joke did not predict anything in the sense of any writer having specific knowledge about Kevin Spacey's actual behavior. MacFarlane has been clear about this. But the joke did encode, in a specific piece of pop culture comedy, a cultural awareness about Spacey that existed in certain circles, a suspicion or knowledge that traveled as rumor through the entertainment industry, and that awareness eventually connected, years later, to a public reality. The Boston Marathon episode is a more straightforwardly eerie coincidence. In March of 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy, in which Peter Griffin befriends a Muslim man who turns out to be part of a terrorist organization. The episode itself attracted criticism for its use of Muslim characters as plot devices in a terrorism storyline. But the specific detail that became infamous occurred in a cutaway sequence, one of those disconnected random jokes for which the show is known, where Peter boasts about winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of runners, mowing them down to reach the finish line first. On the 15th of April, 2013, 1 month after the episode aired, two brothers detonated homemade bombs near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. The coincidence of a Family Guy cutaway involving mass casualties at the Boston Marathon, appearing just weeks before actual mass casualties at the Boston Marathon, was the kind of thing that traveled extremely fast in the early days of social media. Fox pulled the episode from streaming services for a period. There were reports which turned out to be digitally manipulated of the Family Guy episode having predicted the attacks in more specific detail than it actually did, which became their own kind of viral misinformation story. The truth was already strange enough without embellishment. In 2009, the show did an episode about a vaccination refusal epidemic, in which Lois and Peter persuade their community to forego childhood vaccinations, leading to a measles outbreak that puts the town in quarantine. The anti-vaccination movement and its consequences were real subjects of public health concern in 2009. So the episode was not predicting anything that did not already exist as a social phenomenon. But the specific framing a community quarantine resulting from disease spread accelerated by vaccine refusal aligned with disturbing precision with events that would unfold during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, which began in earnest in 2020, 11 years after the episode. The episode even contains moments where the vaccinated members of the community are separated from the unvaccinated, a detail that would feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who lived through the pandemic's various periods of restriction and division. The Caitlyn Jenner coincidence spans multiple episodes, which makes it more detailed than a single throwaway moment. In a Season 7 episode, Stewie makes an observation about Bruce Jenner, the Olympic gold medalist, and, at the time, a member of the Kardashian extended family, suggesting something about his gender. The observation is brief, part of a larger scene, and is played as a quick throwaway joke. 2 episodes later, in Season 10's Lottery Fever, Bruce Jenner appears on stage to perform a burlesque number in feminine costuming. The show returns to this specific idea about Jenner's gender expression more than once, across more than one season, before Jenner publicly announced her transition to Caitlyn Jenner in 2015. This one is interesting because the pattern of jokes suggests that the writing staff had access to, or had developed through observation and Hollywood gossip, an awareness of something that was not yet publicly known. Multiple writers across multiple seasons made the same specific comedic choice about the same specific celebrity's gender identity. That kind of repetition suggests internal cultural knowledge rather than pure coincidence. There is also the Barry Manilow episode and the Bitcoin episode, both of which have their own versions of this phenomenon. In the Barry Manilow case, the show included a joke about Manilow's sexuality years before he publicly discussed his relationship with his longtime partner. In the Bitcoin episode, Peter mentions Bitcoin as a potential get-rich-quick scheme, and the subsequent month saw the cryptocurrency's value increase dramatically, leading some fans to credit Peter Griffin with inspiring the Bitcoin surge, a genuinely absurd chain of causation that nevertheless got seriously discussed on financial websites for a brief period. The Seth MacFarlane 9/11 connection deserves mention here, though it is not a hidden detail within the show but rather a biographical fact about the show's creator that has taken on its own strange quality in the years since. MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 1 on the 11th of September 2001. He missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes, having been given incorrect departure information by his travel agent. Flight 11 was the first plane to be hijacked and the first to hit the World Trade Center. MacFarlane later addressed this directly, noting that he was simultaneously aware of how close he had come to being part of a tragedy and of how his presence on the flight would not have changed anything. He simply would have been another person who died. The show MacFarlane went on to create, and which was continuing to air at that point in 2001, would later make one of the most audacious and controversial episodes in its history by having characters travel back in time specifically to prevent those same attacks and discovering that preventing them made things worse. The fact that the show's creator had personally, by a margin of 10 minutes, escaped the event that the show would later address so provocatively is not something the show has ever directly acknowledged in its own text. But it sits behind the material in a way that gives certain episodes an additional weight, a biographical shadow that changes the temperature of the comedy without appearing explicitly within it. Section 10. Behind the scenes, cameos, and in-jokes from the writer's room. Television writers' rooms are unusual places. They are small, often cramped spaces where a group of people spend enormous amounts of time together developing stories, pitching jokes, arguing about character, laughing too hard at things that will eventually not make the cut, and building a shared culture that is as intense as any small community that forms around shared creative purpose. The people in a writer's room develop inside jokes, references, shorthand, and a whole internal mythology that exists only among them. The best television shows find ways to let that internal mythology leak into the work, not in ways that require the audience to know anything to enjoy what they are watching, but in ways that add an additional layer for anyone who happens to know the specific detail. Family Guy has a rich tradition of this, and the layers buried in various episodes by various writers over the years represent one of the most complete pictures of a television writer's room's internal life that any show has preserved. One of the most discussed examples involves the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery, where Peter Griffin works for much of the show's run. The brewery's name and its associated visual branding, which appears in many episodes, is not simply generic animated background art. The specific design choices, the font on the beer label, the shape of the logo, the color palette were developed by the art department in consultation with the writers, and several of the small details within that design encode references to specific jokes or conversations that happened within the production. This is documented primarily through interviews with production staff, rather than being independently verifiable by looking at the screen, but those interviews suggest that what appears to be a simple piece of background branding carries several layers of internal meaning. The show also has a tradition of naming background characters after members of the production staff. This practice goes back to the very earliest seasons. Background characters who are given names in dialogue, on name tags, in printed text that appears on screen frequently turn out to carry names that belong to real people who worked on the show at various points in its history. This is partly a form of hidden recognition, a way of acknowledging contributors whose names would never appear prominently enough in the credits for most viewers to notice. It is also, undoubtedly, a source of private amusement within the production, the knowledge that you exist somewhere in the show, that a version of your name is walking around in the background of The Drunken Clam or standing in the crowd at one of Peter's misadventures. The writer's room tradition of using its own members as inspiration for characters extends beyond names to personality. Several minor recurring characters in Family Guy are widely understood within the production community to be based, in some detail, on real members of the writing staff. Their specific tics, their particular comedic sensibilities, their recognizable ways of reacting to situations, these things were drawn from real observation of real people and then filtered through the animation process into characters that appear, superficially, to be simply types. The audience laughs at what seems like a well-observed comic type, not knowing that the observation was extremely specific and extremely personal. There is also a layer of writer's room humor embedded in the show's choice of which cultural references to use and how to frame them. The Family Guy writers were, by most accounts, an unusually literate and culturally voracious group people who had wide ranges of reference and who delighted in the specific detail rather than the broad gesture. When they chose a particular film to reference, They often chose a specific scene from that film rather than the film in general. When they referenced a book, they referenced a specific passage or character from the book rather than simply the title. When they parodied a celebrity, they found the most specific and least obvious thing about that celebrity rather than the most commonly imitated attribute. This specificity is itself a form of hidden detail. A joke that references the specific style of the orchestral score in a particular John Williams film is available at its deepest level only to people who know that film well enough to recognize the specific scoring choice. A joke that references a particular paragraph of a particular J.D. Salinger novel requires you to have read the paragraph. A joke that references a specific career decision made by a particular actor in the mid-1970s requires you to know that career in some detail. The show rewards knowledge, and the knowledge it most consistently rewards is the same knowledge that its writers seem to have had broad, specific, enthusiastic, and ranging freely across pop culture, literature, film history, music, sports, science, and American political life. The Easter egg layer of the show is, in a sense, a portrait of the collective mind of the people who made it. One particularly rich example of this involves the way the show handles music. Family Guy has always been unusually attentive to its musical choices, not just in its original compositions, but in the specific pieces of existing music it selects for particular scenes. The show's composers, Ron Jones in the early seasons and Walter Murphy across the full run, were both deeply knowledgeable about film music and classical music, and their scoring of Family Guy episodes frequently contains musical in-jokes that require specialized knowledge to catch. In the Blue Harvest episode, the Imperial March Darth Vader's theme from Star Wars is played in the elevator of the Death Star, but it is played in a jazzy elevator music style. This is funny on the surface. The ominous theme associated with the dark side of the Force is rendered harmless and corporate by the context. But the joke has an additional layer for anyone who knows that elevator music as a genre has specific musical characteristics, a particular kind of harmonic blandness, a specific tempo range, a preference for smoothed-out arrangements of familiar tunes, and recognizes that Walter Murphy has precisely captured those characteristics while applying them to John Williams's original composition. The imitation is accurate enough that it functions as both parody and homage, simultaneously making fun of elevator music and the Imperial March while demonstrating a complete understanding of how both of them work. Ron Jones, who composed for the show during its original run before the show returned from cancellation, is referenced directly in the Brian Does Hollywood episode. In that episode's memorable awards ceremony scene, where pornographic films are being given Academy Award parody trophies, the nominees for Best Original Score include Ron Jones, alongside Walter Murphy and John Williams. Ron Jones is referenced by name in the context of a pornographic film scoring award. This is clearly an in-joke for anyone who knew his work on the show, a joke that rewards knowledge of Family Guy's own musical history by including one of the show's own composers in an absurd context. For most viewers, Jones's name meant nothing. For anyone who followed animation music closely enough to know who had scored which shows, it was a moment of specific recognition. The tradition of including the show's own musical history in the text of episodes extends to the opening theme, which was composed by Walter Murphy. Murphy's composing style, and specifically his arrangement of the Family Guy theme, has been referenced within the show in ways that only make sense if you know enough about music theory to recognize what he is doing. At certain points in the show's run, when the opening theme plays, the harmonic structure of the arrangement has been subtly different from the standard version in ways that encode information: a change in key, a different instrumentation choice, a variation in tempo that functions as a kind of musical Easter egg for trained musicians watching the show. Section 11. The time travel episodes and their deeply layered hidden details. If there is a single type of episode that consistently produces the most Easter eggs, the most hidden layers, the most material that rewards close and repeated attention, it is the time travel episode. Family Guy's relationship with time travel runs throughout its entire history, and the time travel episodes, particularly the ones that involve Brian and Stewie, tend to be the episodes where the writers and animators allowed themselves to be most elaborate, most self-referential, and most willing to embed material that the average viewer would never see. The episode Back to the Pilot, which aired on the 13th of November 2011, a date that was itself a piece of hidden information because November 13th, 2011 fell on a Sunday and was thus the show's typical broadcast night. But the specific date was also 10 years, 10 months, and 13 days after the 11th of September 2001. The event that becomes central to the episode's plot is the most structurally complex and most Easter egg-dense episode in the entire run of the show. The premise is elegant. Brian wants to find a tennis ball he buried on January 31st, 1999, the day of the pilot episode's broadcast, and Stewie uses his time machine to take him back to that specific date. They arrive in the world of the very first Family Guy episode, and this arrival is treated with extraordinary care by the animation team. The family that Stewie and Brian encounter in 1999 is drawn in the original film Roman animation style, with the rougher lines and the specific character proportions of the pilot. This is a notable visual difference from the animation style that had been in use since the show's revival in 2005, and most viewers who had been watching since the revival would likely have registered the difference as a deliberate choice without necessarily knowing its specific significance. But the viewers who had watched the show since 1999, who remembered what the Griffins looked like in that first episode, would have experienced the animation shift as a genuine act of preservation. The show going back to its original visual identity with what appeared to be affection and care, treating the early look of the show not as an embarrassment but as a form of history worth honoring. Stewie, watching the original Griffins in their original animation, notices several specific errors that were actually present in the pilot episode. He observes that Peter's eye overlaps with his nose in certain frames. This is a real animation error that actually occurred in Death Has a Shadow, and which animators noticed at the time, but which was left in the final broadcast. He comments that Meg's voice sounds different, which is a direct reference to the fact that Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert in the first season before Mila Kunis took over from season 2 onward. These are not jokes invented for this episode. They are references to real, documented aspects of the show's production history, the kind of things that animation historians and devoted fans had noted and cataloged over the years. The episode is acknowledging that history, treating it as worthy of acknowledgement, validating the attention that had been paid to those details. When Stewie says Meg's voice sounds different and adds something like, "She sounds like someone who's about to lose a huge opportunity," it is a joke, but it is also a genuinely accurate description of what happened in real life. Lacey Chabert was not recast because anyone was unhappy with her performance, but because of contractual complexities that led her to choose not to commit to the full show. The episode then does something unexpected and controversial. Brian, having arrived in the past, tells his 1999 self about the September 11th attacks. He warns past Brian about what is coming, apparently with the intention of preventing it. When they return to the present, the consequences of this warning have been catastrophic. By preventing the attacks, Brian's intervention ensured that George W. Bush, who the episode presents as having won the 2004 election by exploiting public fear after 9/11, instead lost to John Kerry. Without his political mandate, Bush, in this alternate timeline, eventually returns to Texas, and Texas, along with the rest of the southern states, secedes from the Union, starting a second American Civil War. By 2016 of the alternate timeline, the East Coast is a nuclear wasteland. Over 17 million people are dead. The political commentary embedded in this alternate timeline is itself a kind of Easter egg, a specific argument about the political legacy of September 11th, the relationship between national tragedy and political manipulation, and the way fear has been used as a tool of governance. The episode is making a serious point about American political history while also making it impossible to take the point entirely seriously, because it is being made through the mechanism of a cartoon dog doing something stupid with a time machine. The seriousness is available if you want it, and the comedy is available if you do not. There are also several purely structural Easter eggs in the episode that are available only to very close attention. When Stewie and Brian arrive in 1999, their appearance in the past creates a paradox. The original Stewie encounters the 2011 Stewie, and the two of them have a conversation. 2011. Stewie has to explain himself to 1999 Stewie, and in doing so has to be careful not to reveal too much about the future. The conversation between the two Stewies is written so that 2011 Stewie speaks in ways that carefully avoid confirming specific future events, while also being technically truthful about everything he says. This level of careful dialogue writing, ensuring that no specific piece of future knowledge leaks from one Stewie to the other, required significant attention to the logic of what each Stewie knows and when he knows it. That attention is not called out in the episode. It simply exists in the dialogue for anyone paying close enough attention to notice it. The episode's resolution, where multiple Stewies and Brians from various alternate timelines all appear simultaneously to try to prevent each other from doing various things, is a direct visual reference to the Star Trek, the Next Generation episode Parallels, in which multiple versions of the Enterprise appear in the same space when the space-time continuum fractures. This is a specific enough reference that it requires actual knowledge of Star Trek, TNG, to recognize, and it is presented without comment, simply there, in the visual composition of the scene for the person who knows what they are looking at. There is also a detail that only someone who had memorized a specific piece of Family Guy trivia would catch. In the episode, a news anchor in the alternate future mentions a football player named Pat Tillman being tackled by his own team. This is a reference to the real Pat Tillman, the NFL player who left his career to serve in the military following September 11th and was killed in 2004 by friendly fire, literally, tragically, by his own side. In the alternate timeline where 9/11 never happened, there was no September 11th to motivate Tillman's military service, and so Tillman remained a football player. And the metaphor of being tackled by your own team, which in the real world applied to the manner of his death, is in the alternate timeline merely a description of a play in a football game. The joke requires you to know who Pat Tillman is, how he died, and why the specific image of being harmed by your own people carries particular resonance in his case. The time travel episode Yug Yilimov from season 11 takes the time travel premise in a completely different direction and generates its own category of hidden detail. In this episode, time begins moving backwards due to a malfunction in Stewie's time machine. The episode is played forwards for the viewer. We watch events in their normal order, but the characters experience them in reverse, and the dialogue and action are written so that they make sense in both directions simultaneously. This is an extremely technically demanding piece of writing that requires every scene to function as both a moment in a forward-moving narrative and a moment in a reverse-moving one, and the moments where these two readings produce something meaningful rather than just technically correct are the ones that constitute genuine Easter egg surprises that reveal themselves only when you watch the episode twice, once in each direction, or when you stop to think about what a particular scene must have looked like from the character's perspective while they were living through it backwards. The episode also contains in its resolution a detail that connects to an earlier Stewie and Brian episode in a way that is not signaled by the current episode's dialogue. Something that Stewie says in the resolution of Yug Yilimov echoes almost precisely a moment from an earlier Brian and Stewie adventure in a way that suggests continuity in their relationship, a shared history that the show was accumulating across episodes. This kind of cross-episode callback is available only to viewers who have watched the episodes in order and retained enough detail to recognize the echo. For those viewers, it functions as confirmation that the show's internal history has weight, that events from earlier episodes continue to matter in the present one. Section 12. The DVD and home media Easter eggs you never knew were hidden there. The discovery of Family Guy Easter eggs accelerated dramatically when the show became available on DVD. Home video formats that allowed pausing, rewinding, and frame-by-frame advancement turned a show that had been designed with hidden details into something far more accessible to the people who wanted to find those details. What had previously required perfect timing and a very quick eye, the ability to register a joke that appeared for a single frame in a broadcast that moved at standard speed, became something that anyone with a DVD player and enough curiosity could find. The production team was aware of this, and they responded by building Easter eggs specifically into the DVD format details that were not accessible in the broadcast version at all, that existed only in the physical media experience, designed specifically for the fan who bought the box set and wanted something extra for their money. One of the most discussed DVD Easter eggs in Family Guy history involves the DVD menu for one of the early season sets. When navigating the DVD menu, the interface that allowed you to select episodes, access special features, and configure your viewing options, there was a hidden interaction available. If you pressed a specific directional button on your remote, while the cursor was positioned between two specific characters in the menu design, a symbol that was otherwise invisible would appear briefly on screen. Selecting or clicking that symbol would unlock a hidden feature, a brief piece of bonus content that was not listed anywhere in the official menu structure, and that could only be found by knowing it existed and knowing exactly where to look. This kind of DVD Easter egg was common enough in the home video industry during the early 2000s that it had its own community of collectors and hunters, people who made it their mission to find and document hidden DVD features, sharing the instructions for accessing them on early internet forums. Family Guy's participation in this tradition signaled something about how the show understood its own audience. The people who bought the DVD box sets were the most committed viewers, the ones willing to pay for content they could have consumed for free on television reruns. Hiding something for them in the physical product was a way of acknowledging that commitment with something specific and personal. The special features on the Family Guy DVD sets themselves contain layers of hidden material. The behind-the-scenes content, the table reads, the animatics, these are all officially part of the disc's special features. But within them, embedded in the visual background of behind-the-scenes footage, are small moments that function as their own category of Easter egg. Real production details, real glimpses of the writer's room, real moments between cast and crew that were captured on camera and then left in the background of a special feature rather than cut. These moments are not intended as Easter eggs in the same way that a deliberately hidden DVD secret is intended. They are simply the accidental consequence of shooting a lot of footage in the real-world spaces where the show was made, and then including some of that footage in the release. But the effect is the same as any other Easter egg. The attentive viewer who studies the background of behind-the-scenes material closely enough will find things that most people will miss, and those things will tell them something real about the show and the people who made it. The Season 6 DVD set for Family Guy, the set that includes Blue Harvest, contains a special feature that documents every reference to Star Wars that had appeared in Family Guy up to that point in the show's history. This feature, assembled by the production team specifically for the DVD release, amounts to a complete catalog of Star Wars Easter eggs across 6 seasons of the show, and it reveals just how many of those references had been present without fanfare in the normal flow of episodes. The feature makes visible what had been invisible. It turns the background layer of one show's engagement with another show into foreground material, allowing viewers to see the full shape of something that had previously only been accessible piece by piece across many individual episodes. The Blue Harvest disc also includes, in its collection of special features, 2 very brief Easter eggs that function specifically as teases for future content. These are mentioned quickly in one review of the disc and then passed over, but they represent a fascinating piece of production history. The Easter eggs in question confirmed, before it was publicly announced, that the Family Guy team was already working on a sequel to Blue Harvest, specifically the second Star Wars parody that would eventually become Something, Something, Something Dark Side. Finding them was a way of learning about a future release before the official announcement, a reward for the specific kind of fan who bought the disc and looked hard enough to find hidden features. This kind of forward-teasing Easter egg, the hidden detail that promises something not yet officially confirmed, has appeared several other times in Family Guy's home media release history. A detail embedded in one season's disc that refers obliquely to a storyline from a subsequent season, a visual element in a special feature that reappears, in a different context, in an episode that aired much later. These connections are not always easy to verify. The show's production history is complicated enough that distinguishing between a deliberate callback and a coincidental similarity requires sometimes more information than is publicly available. But the existence of deliberate, forward-teasing Easter eggs in at least some cases suggests a production team that thought carefully about the relationship between their home media releases and their ongoing storytelling. They were not just packaging past content for sale. They were using the packaging as a mechanism for communicating with their audience about future content in a language that only the most attentive members of that audience would understand. There is also an entire category of Easter eggs that exist in the audio of the show rather than the visual. Family Guy has always been unusually attentive to its sound design, more attentive, perhaps, than it sometimes gets credit for. The Wilhelm scream, a specific piece of archival audio that has been used in films since the 1950s and that has become a kind of inside joke among film sound editors, appearing in movies and television shows as a hidden nod to the community of people who recognize it, appears several times throughout Family Guy's run. Each appearance is in a slightly different context, serving a slightly different scene, but always performed in a way that suggests the sound team was aware they were using a specific historical sound effect with cultural significance rather than simply a random scream. For the viewer who knows the Wilhelm scream's history, who recognizes it when they hear it, who understands why it was used, who appreciates the specific joke being made by its inclusion, each appearance is a small gift. For everyone else, it is simply a scream that someone makes when they fall or get hurt. The joke exists in layers that are activated by knowledge, and the show provides it without comment or acknowledgement, trusting that the people who know will know and the people who do not will simply move on. Section 13. The show watching itself. When Family Guy looked in the mirror, there is a particular kind of Easter egg that is unique to long-running, shows the kind that only becomes possible after enough years have passed, that the show has generated its own internal history substantial enough to reference. The show's relationship with its own past is one of the most interesting dimensions of Family Guy's Easter egg tradition, and it produced some of the most emotionally resonant hidden details in the show's catalog. The episode Back to the Pilot is again the most concentrated example of this, but it is far from the only one. Across many seasons, Family Guy developed a habit of looping back into its own history, referencing specific earlier episodes, acknowledging character decisions that had been made in previous seasons, building on the accumulated weight of 20-plus years of storytelling to create moments that mean something different to longtime viewers than they mean to newcomers. One of the most effective uses of this technique involves the Stewie and Brian dynamic and the specific evolution of their friendship. In the earliest seasons of the show, Stewie and Brian had a relatively simple relationship. Brian was one of the only characters who could understand Stewie's elaborate evil genius speech, and their friendship was built primarily on Brian's weary tolerance of Stewie's plans and Stewie's grudging respect for Brian's intellectual company. Over the course of many seasons, this friendship became increasingly central to the show and increasingly emotionally complex, until by the later seasons, the relationship between these two characters, a talking dog and an evil baby, now no longer quite so evil, was genuinely affecting, in ways that required you to have watched many years of their interactions to fully feel. Certain later episodes are structured as Easter eggs in this sense. They reference specific conversations, specific moments of connection or conflict from much earlier seasons in ways that reward the viewer who has been paying attention to those conversations and moments for years. A line of dialogue that echoes something said 5 seasons earlier, a visual callback to a specific setting that appeared once in season 3 and never again until this moment. These moments function not as hidden details in the traditional sense. They are not invisible on first viewing, but as hidden rewards for long-term investment, available fully only to the people who have been watching long enough to feel the echo. The Life of Brian episode, the season 12 episode in which Brian is killed, is, in hindsight, an Easter egg in this sense, though whether it was intended as such is unclear. The episode played Brian's death completely straight, without any indication that it would be reversed. It was treated as permanent by the narrative, and by the characters' emotional responses, and by the show's external publicity. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie uses his time machine to prevent Brian's death, and he comes back. The trick of treating the death as permanent was revealed, retroactively, to have been a form of misdirection. The kind of misdirection that only works if the audience has accumulated enough trust in the show's willingness to make permanent changes, that they take the death at face value. For viewers who watch those 2 episodes in real time, across the actual 2-week gap between their broadcast dates, the emotional impact of the first episode was real, and the reversal in the second episode hit differently because of how much weight had been given to the first one. For viewers who discovered the episodes later, watching them back-to-back or in quick succession, the emotional arc plays out very differently. The death does not have time to land as real before the reversal arrives. The Easter egg in this case was the window of time between the 2 broadcasts. The genuine grief of the fans who processed Brian's death between the two episodes was both the audience response that the show was generating and the setup for the reveal in the episode that followed. When Brian returns, the show does something small that most people missed entirely. Stewie, having retrieved Brian from the moment before his death, is standing in the street holding him. They have just been reunited, and then, in a brief moment before the scene moves on, Stewie says something to Brian that echoes almost exactly, with only minor variations, a thing he said in a much earlier episode about what Brian means to him. It is not reproduced verbatim. It does not call attention to itself as a callback. But for the viewer who had heard the earlier version of those words, the echo is unmistakable, and the echo transforms a relief scene into something more complex. A recognition that the show knew what it had been building between these two characters, that the weight of all those years was present in that moment, that the reunion meant what it did because of the accumulated history that preceded it. This kind of long-delayed payoff is perhaps the most sophisticated form of Easter egg that a television show can produce. It requires patience both from the writers, who have to hold the detail across many seasons while remaining confident that the payoff will be worth the wait, and from the audience, who have to maintain enough continuous attention across years of episodes that they are still in possession of the original detail when the payoff finally arrives. Family Guy, for all its reputation as a show built on disconnected random comedy, contains more of these long-delayed payoffs than most people would expect. The comedy is often random. The storytelling underneath the comedy is sometimes more patient and more carefully constructed than the surface suggests. Section 14. The Grand Architecture. What the Easter eggs tell us about the show. After traveling through all of these layers, the hidden newspaper headlines and the background signs, the Blue Harvest rabbit hole, the crossover cameos, the writer's room in-jokes, the uncanny predictions, the DVD secrets, the show watching itself, it seems worth pausing to ask what all of this adds up to. What does the existence of so many hidden details, maintained over so many years, tell us about the show that produced them? The first thing it tells us is that Family Guy, at its best, operated with a dual audience in mind. There was the primary audience, the many millions of viewers who watched the show on Sunday nights on Fox, laughing at the cutaway gags and the character comedy and the broad parodies that made the show famous. And there was the secondary audience, smaller, more patient, more devoted, the people who bought the DVDs and paused them, who watched episodes multiple times, who developed the kind of detailed knowledge of the show's internal history and external references that allowed them to access the layer underneath. The existence of that secondary audience layer is a form of respect for curiosity, for attention, for the kind of love that manifests as wanting to know more than you are being told. The writers were not hiding things to be difficult. They were hiding things because they trusted that some proportion of their audience would look for them, and they wanted that proportion to be rewarded. The second thing it tells us is that the show had a genuine relationship with the culture around it, a real, curious, attentive relationship that was not simply about making references for the sake of making references. The best Easter eggs in Family Guy are not random. They are specific. The choice of Blue Harvest as a title, the choice of Magic Johnson as a Death Star briefer, the choice of Redrum for Stewie's blocks. Each of these represents a decision made by someone who thought carefully about what they were putting in the frame and why they were putting it there. The reference was chosen because it was the right reference, because the connection between the reference and the moment was real rather than arbitrary. The third thing it tells us is that the show's writers were, to an unusual degree, in conversation with their own history. The time travel episodes, the callbacks, the long-delayed payoffs, these are the behaviors of a creative team that took the show's internal history seriously, that believed the accumulated weight of many seasons was something worth preserving and building on, rather than something to be discarded in favor of whatever was freshest. The show could be lazy. It was frequently lazy. But the Easter egg layer of the show was almost never lazy. It was the place where the care lived, the place where the show's intelligence was most consistently visible. And the fourth thing, perhaps the most important thing, is that all of these hidden details represent a kind of invitation. Come closer, they say. Look harder. Stay longer. The show will give you more if you are willing to go looking for it. In a media landscape that often rewards nothing more than passive consumption, where the easiest thing is to sit back and let the entertainment wash over you without engaging with it at any depth, Family Guy was saying something slightly unusual. It was saying that the people who engaged deeply would find things that the people who watched casually would not find. That depth of engagement was worth something, that the audience in some sense got to choose how much the show gave them back. This is the secret of all great Easter eggs, not just Family Guys. They are not bonus content. They are a form of relationship. They are the show reaching through the screen toward a specific kind of viewer and saying, "You, the one paying attention, we see you." And for 25 years, in the background of hundreds of episodes, in the fine print of newspaper headlines, and the text of license plates and the faces in crowd scenes, and the choice of a very particular DVD menu secret, Family Guy kept saying it. Section 15. The stranger details overlooked corners of the show's history. Some of the most interesting Easter eggs in Family Guy are not the famous ones. The Blue Harvest title, the Red Rum blocks, the DVD pausing headline, these are documented and well known among devoted fans. But there are quieter details, stranger details, things that have been noted by only a small number of people and that have not entered the broader conversation about the show's hidden content. The license plate on Jesus' car in North by North Quahog reads WWID, which we noted earlier. But the specificity of that choice goes deeper than the simple pun. WWJD, what would Jesus do? Was, in the early 2000s, a piece of evangelical Christian culture that had become a mainstream consumer product. Bracelets, bumper stickers, keychains, t-shirts, all of them bearing those four letters, all of them functioning simultaneously as a statement of faith and a piece of pop culture merchandise. The relationship between sincere religious commitment and commercial product had become, in the WWJD phenomenon, almost impossible to disentangle. You could not easily tell whether the person wearing the bracelet was expressing genuine devotion or simply participating in a trend. The Family Guy response to this, putting WWID on the car of the actual Jesus, asking what the actual Jesus would do in the first person, removing the reverent distance of the third-person formulation, is a genuinely sharp piece of religious satire that requires the full cultural context of the WWJD moment to land. It is not anti-religious. It is not mocking Jesus. It is mocking the way the cultural industry had processed a piece of religious sincerity into a consumer product, and it is doing so in a way that is available only to viewers who remember the WWJD phenomenon clearly enough to feel the satirical bite. There are similar moments scattered throughout the show's history where a background detail carries more satirical weight than its placement suggests. A sign in the background of a government building scene that comments, in tiny readable text, on a specific policy debate that was occurring at the time the episode was produced. A magazine cover visible in the background of a doctor's waiting room that references, with obvious intent, a celebrity scandal that was just breaking when the episode was in production. A television program playing silently in the background of a bar scene that is, for a viewer who recognizes it, a specific show that has a specific relationship to the political themes the episode is exploring. These details are not always funny. Some of them are simply true. They are the show's way of acknowledging the world outside itself, of recognizing that the stories it was telling existed within a particular historical moment. The Easter eggs in these cases function less as comedy and more as a form of testimony, the show quietly noting what was happening for the benefit of anyone who cared to look. There is also an entire category of what we might call negative Easter eggs moments where the show conspicuously did not include something, where the absence of a reference is itself the reference. These are the hardest to document because the evidence is, by definition, invisible. But there are cases in the show's history where specific actors, shows, or cultural phenomena that one would expect a show of this type to reference are conspicuously absent, and that absence traces back to real relationships between the show's production and those external entities. The most documented version of this involves the Harry Shearer situation. Shearer is the voice actor responsible for many of the most iconic Simpsons characters, including Mr. Burns, Waylon Smithers, Kent Brockman, and Principal Skinner. Every other principal voice actor from The Simpsons appeared in the Simpsons Guy crossover episode. Shearer did not, reportedly because a deal could not be reached. His characters were conspicuously absent from the crossover, their voices not heard, their presences not visible in crowd scenes. Someone looking for Mr. Burns and not finding him in an episode explicitly designed to combine two shows' entire character rosters was seeing a negative Easter egg. The absence of a specific character encoding real-world information about relationships and agreements behind the scenes. The show has also at various points made jokes about specific things and then seemed to go quiet on those jokes in subsequent seasons in ways that suggest something changed. A recurring bit involving a specific public figure that abruptly stopped appearing after a particular real-world event. A running joke that vanished from the show's vocabulary after news of a specific development made the joke no longer workable. The absences, if you are attentive enough to notice them, tell stories about the world outside the show in the same way that the presences do. And then there are the details that exist at the boundary between Easter egg and coincidence moments, so specific that they seem deliberately placed, but for which no production-side documentation has confirmed the intent. A background character who appears in exactly 3 episodes, in seemingly unrelated contexts, who bears a visual resemblance to a real person involved in a real event that was in the news during each of those episodes' production periods. A musical cue that plays during a scene with a specific emotional resonance, and that, when you investigate the original context of the piece of music, turns out to have been composed for a film with a strikingly parallel narrative. A detail visible in one frame of one scene that only makes sense in the context of an episode from 4 seasons earlier. These borderline cases are where the Easter egg tradition becomes genuinely philosophical, where the question of what counts as a hidden detail becomes a question about intention and meaning and the relationship between creators and their audiences across years of shared attention. The Family Guy writers put a lot of things in the background of their show. Some of those things were deliberate Easter eggs. Some were in-jokes for the production staff. Some were background art that carries significance the animators did not fully think through. Some may be pure coincidence read as significance by fans who love the show enough to find meaning in everything it does. The show cannot distinguish these categories for you, neither can I. What I can tell you is that the act of looking, the act of paying close attention to the corners of the frame, pausing when something catches your eye, asking what the text says and why it says that, and who it was put there for is its own reward, independent of whether every specific thing you find was placed there with deliberate intent. The attention itself is the Easter egg. The willingness to look harder than the show requires you to look is the secret handshake. And the show, which has been in conversation with its own most devoted audience for 25 years, knows this. It has always known this. Section 16. The Hidden Future. What we are still finding. The discovery of Family Guy Easter eggs has not stopped. It continues, and in some ways it accelerates, because new tools make it easier to find what was hidden in old episodes. The same episode that broadcast at standard definition in 1999 can now be watched in high definition on a streaming service, with pausing and frame stepping that is more precise than anything a DVD player could offer. Fans with modern screens and modern tools can see background details that were genuinely invisible to anyone watching on the television sets of the early 2000s. This means that new discoveries continue to emerge from episodes that have been considered thoroughly examined. A background sign whose text was unreadable at the resolution available to earlier investigators turns out, at high definition, to contain a joke. An animated character whose face in the background of a crowd scene was blurry at old resolutions turns out, at high definition, to be recognizable as someone specific. Details that were deliberately inserted into the frame, but were practically invisible given the technology of the time they were produced, become legible in the technology of later decades. There is something poignant about this. The people who hid those details in the 1990s and early 2000s did so knowing that they might never be found, not because no one would care to look, but because the resolution required to find them did not yet exist in common consumer technology. They were hiding things for audiences they could not yet anticipate, trusting that the technology would eventually catch up and make the finding possible. That trust was justified. The audience caught up. The resolution got there. And the details, patient and unchanged in the frame where they were placed 20 or 25 years ago, finally became visible. This is what it means for a show to take the long view. It is not just about what you can do for the audience that exists right now. It is about what you can leave for the audience that will exist later, the more technically capable audience, the more thoroughly investigating audience. The audience that arrives with tools and patience and a curiosity that the production team in 1999 could only hope would eventually develop. Family Guy, in its best moments, always seemed to be making something for both audiences at once. The one watching now, who sees the surface, and the one who will come back later, with different tools and different patience, who will find the layer underneath. We are that second audience, and we are still finding things. If you have made it all the way to the end of this, then you are exactly the kind of person this was made for, the kind who pays attention, the kind who wants the layer underneath. Thank you for spending this time here, and for your patience through all of these details. If any of these Easter eggs surprised you, if there is one that made you sit up a little straighter, or made you want to go back and rewatch a specific episode with fresh eyes, drop it in the comments. Tell me which one got you. I genuinely love reading those. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment to do it. It is completely free. It keeps this kind of long, slow, careful exploration coming. Hit the subscribe button, leave your notification bell on, and you will be here for the next one. There are always more layers. There is always more to find. Sleep well. End of script. Section 17. The Chicken Fight chronicles a hidden epic within the show. Of all the recurring elements in Family Guy that contain more depth than they initially appear to, the ongoing feud between Peter Griffin and a giant chicken named Ernie is perhaps the strangest and most elaborate. On the surface, the recurring giant chicken fight is one of the show's most reliably absurd running gags. Peter encounters a giant anthropomorphic chicken, specifically a male chicken named Ernie, though the show rarely names him. The two of them get into a fight, and what begins as a simple altercation escalates through multiple minutes of cartoon ultra-violence that takes them through grocery stores, construction sites, skyscrapers, and occasionally into orbit. The fights are extraordinary pieces of action animation, lovingly produced to a degree that exceeds the surrounding episode by a significant margin. They cost considerably more time and budget to produce than a normal scene, and they deliver something genuinely different from the show's usual visual vocabulary. But the fights have hidden content that most casual viewers have completely missed. The origin of the feud, a coupon for free chicken that turned out to be expired, is established early in the show's history. Peter's rage at the chicken originates in a mundane consumer grievance, and the ongoing cosmic scale of their violence is the show's joke about how minor irritations can fester into something disproportionate. The specificity of the expired coupon is important. It is not some grand insult or existential wound. It is the kind of tiny frustration that most adults encounter and forget within an hour. The fact that this particular frustration has been nursed into a generation-spanning blood feud between Peter Griffin and a giant chicken is the joke. But across different appearances of the chicken fight, careful viewers notice that the fights were not simply random. They seemed to build on each other, to accumulate narrative weight, to develop the relationship between Peter and Ernie in ways that were never articulated in dialogue, but that existed in the physical grammar of the fights themselves. In the earliest chicken fights, the violence is presented with obvious, absurdist comedy intent. Two things that should not be fighting are fighting, and the escalation of the fight into increasingly improbable settings is the source of the humor. But as the fights recur across many seasons, subtle changes in the choreography of the violence suggest an evolution. By the time of the later chicken fights, the exchanges between Peter and Ernie have a quality of worn familiarity. The two combatants moving through their violence the way long-married people move through an argument, with the efficiency of deep mutual knowledge. They know each other's patterns. They know what the other one is going to do before they do it. One of the chicken fights ends not with a definitive victory, but with a kind of exhausted mutual withdrawal. Peter and Ernie, having destroyed much of the surrounding environment, appear to look at each other for a long moment before going their separate ways. Nothing is resolved. No winner is declared. They simply stop fighting for now, the way the chicken fight has always stopped, not because the cause of the conflict has been addressed, but because neither participant has the energy to continue. The expired coupon is never mentioned. The underlying grievance is never resolved. In Season 11, there is a chicken fight episode that does something unexpected with the format. During the fight, after many minutes of escalating violence, there is a brief pause in which Peter and Ernie simply look at each other. And in that pause, The episode allows something to be communicated between them that has never been directly stated, some combination of fatigue and grudging respect, and the absurd recognition that they are going to keep doing this forever. Because the alternative is to actually resolve something, which neither of them knows how to do. The moment is played without comment. The fight resumes. Nothing changes. But the moment is there for the viewer who is paying attention to the evolution of the relationship across all of the previous fights. There is also hidden visual content in the environments the chicken fights traverse. The settings are never random. The specific locations the fight moves through, the grocery store, the aircraft carrier, the office building, have been chosen to reflect the economic and social geography of the American life the show inhabits. Peter's fights with the chicken move through American commercial space, the way American commercial space moves through American lives. Unavoidable, exhausting, usually ending in some kind of destruction of the very spaces you thought were stable ground. The chicken fight is, among other things, a sustained visual metaphor for the experience of trying to navigate the institutions of American life as someone who does not quite fit inside them. And that metaphor is never stated. It simply exists in the accumulated geography of 30-plus minutes of cartoon violence spread across 2 decades of television. Section 18. Stewie's Timeline. The continuity hiding in plain sight. For a show that operates largely on an episodic, mostly continuity-free structure where the events of one episode rarely have lasting consequences in the next, Stewie Griffin's personal history contains more genuine internal continuity than any other character on the show, and much of that continuity is hidden in details that are easy to miss on first viewing. The evolution of Stewie from the malevolent evil genius of the early seasons to the more emotionally open, friendship-oriented character of the later seasons is a change that the show acknowledges explicitly in some moments and ignores in others. But embedded within that larger character trajectory are small, specific details that track his history with unusual precision. His time machine, for instance, accumulates a history. The device has been used many times across many seasons, and each use has left traces. There are episodes where Stewie can recall specific previous trips not with perfect accuracy, but with the kind of partial memory that suggests a real experiential history rather than a blank slate reset between episodes. The errors in his memory, when they occur, are consistent with the specific nature of the trips he has taken. The kinds of distortions that time travel, in the show's internal logic, produces. There are also details in Stewie's bedroom visible in background shots across many episodes that track his evolving interests and relationships. The toys and equipment visible in early season bedroom scenes are specifically engineered weaponry and world domination paraphernalia. In later season bedroom backgrounds, these items have been gradually replaced by objects reflecting his broader emotional life, things associated with Brian, with particular interests that he developed in specific episodes, with relationships that have taken on meaning over the years. The bedroom is a visual record of the character's evolution, available to anyone who has watched enough episodes to know what to compare to what. The relationship between Stewie and his teddy bear Rupert is one of the most consistent long-game Easter eggs in the show's history. Rupert appears in many episodes, always in Stewie's possession, always treated by Stewie as a genuine companion rather than a simple prop. The depth of Stewie's attachment to Rupert, treated as real by Stewie, often treated as comic by the other characters who observe it, is one of the most consistent signals in the show's long history that whatever else Stewie is, he is also genuinely deeply a child. His genius, his evil plans, his British accent, and his articulate philosophical speeches, none of these change the fact that he has a bear named Rupert that he will not relinquish. When Brian destroys Rupert in a later episode, the scene is treated as genuinely traumatic for Stewie. And the emotional weight of that moment, which is enormous given what the scene depicts, can only be fully felt by someone who has been watching Rupert appear in episode after episode for many years, someone for whom the bear has accumulated the weight of all those accumulated appearances. For a new viewer encountering the episode cold, Stewie's reaction might seem disproportionate. For anyone who has been watching since the beginning, the reaction is exactly right. The bear was always there. The bear mattered. The history of Stewie's friendship with Brian is told largely through the accumulation of small moments across many episodes, brief exchanges, shared looks, jokes that land differently because of the history that precedes them. There is no single episode that is the definitive Stewie and Brian episode. The relationship exists in the aggregate of all of the episodes, and its full texture is available only to someone who has watched enough of those episodes to feel the aggregate. This is the quietest and perhaps the deepest form of Easter egg that a long-running show can produce. The relationship that exists not in any single scene but in the space between scenes. In the accumulation of time spent watching these characters together, in the knowledge that what you are witnessing in any given moment is the latest chapter of a history that began many episodes ago and will continue into future episodes that have not yet been made. Section 918. The Sound Layer Musical Easter Eggs and Audio Secrets. Most discussions of Family Guy Easter eggs focus on the visual, on what can be seen in the background of frames, on text that can be read when the image is paused, on faces that can be recognized when the camera holds still long enough. But Family Guy has a rich tradition of Easter eggs that exist in the audio as well, details that can only be found by listening with the same attention that visual Easter egg hunters bring to looking. The Wilhelm Scream's appearances throughout the show have already been mentioned, but the audio Easter egg tradition goes considerably further. In several episodes, the background music contains quotations from other pieces of music that are not explicitly acknowledged. A scene in a restaurant will have background music playing in the restaurant's ambient sound design that turns out, on close listening, to be a piece of film score that has a thematic relationship to what is happening in the scene, not the show's own score, but something diegetic, something playing in the space that the characters inhabit, chosen with specific intent. The relationship between the background music choice and the scene's content is a hidden editorial comment, a piece of music criticism embedded in the sound design. Walter Murphy's score for the show contains numerous musical Easter eggs that require genuine musical education to hear. Murphy is an unusually accomplished composer. He had a hit single in the 1970s with a disco arrangement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Under the name Walter Murphy and the Big Apple Band, and his work on Family Guy reflects a deep engagement with the Western classical tradition. When he scores a scene that is thematically related to a specific piece of classical music, he will occasionally quote that piece within his own score, briefly, quietly, in a way that most listeners will not consciously identify, but that trained musicians will hear immediately. In the Blue Harvest episode, the music in the Death Star elevator was discussed as a jazzy version of the Imperial March. But Murphy's arrangement of the Imperial March in that scene contains, buried within its chords, a brief quotation from a completely different piece of film music, a piece whose thematic connection to the idea of the elevator and to the specific character using the elevator rewards recognition. This quotation is available only to someone listening carefully enough to hear through the parody and identify the underlying musical content. There is also an audio Easter egg tradition in the show's use of original songs. Family Guy has always incorporated original musical numbers into its episodes, often elaborate song and dance sequences that are clearly expensive to produce and that represent a significant investment of creative energy. These original songs frequently contain in-jokes for listeners who know enough about musical theater, about American popular music history, or about the specific careers of the voice actors performing them to recognize what the songs are doing beneath the surface of their lyrics. In the episode And Then There Were Fewer, which aired as a Season 9 premiere and was structured as a murder mystery, the musical scoring of the episode is calibrated to reference the conventions of classic murder mystery film scoring. The specific pieces of music that are quoted and the specific aspects of murder mystery musical grammar that Murphy employs are chosen with enough precision that someone with a background in film music history would recognize the references as a kind of love letter to the genre, a way of acknowledging that the episode knew exactly what tradition it was working in and had done the reading on that tradition. The show also hides audio callbacks between episodes in ways that parallel the visual callbacks we have discussed in other sections. A piece of music that appears in one episode will be reprised, sometimes transformed, sometimes virtually identical in a much later episode that revisits the themes or characters of the first one. These musical callbacks are not always obvious because the episodes between them may have involved many different pieces of music, diluting the listener's ability to remember the original appearance of the motif. But when they appear, and when you recognize them, They function as confirmation that the show's musical identity has an internal architecture, that the scores of individual episodes are not simply standalone pieces of functional music, but chapters in a larger musical. Narrative. One of the most technically sophisticated audio Easter eggs in the show's history involves an episode where time runs backwards, and the audio had to be constructed so that it would function correctly when played in its reverse state. The animators and sound designers spent significant time ensuring that the reversed audio contained moments of genuine recognizability, places where the reversed sound was not simply noise, but was itself something meaningful or comic. Some of these reversed audio moments, when the episode is played with the audio reversed back to normal speed, reveal content that was not present in the forward playback. This is a labor-intensive and almost completely invisible form of Easter egg, one that can only be found by actually reversing the audio of a recorded episode and listening to what it contains. The tradition of hiding audio content in reverse tracks goes back to vinyl records and the rumored backwards messages in certain rock albums, a phenomenon known as backmasking that inspired significant public controversy in the 1980s. Family Guy's use of reversed audio content engages with that cultural history while also simply being a very technically elaborate way to hide a joke that almost no one will ever find. It is the definition of going further than you need to go for the sake of a detail that will delight a very small number of very specific people. Section 20. Peter Griffin's Wall, the most patient Easter egg in the show's history. There is a detail in Family Guy that has been quietly accumulating since the show's very early seasons, a detail that exists in the decor of the Griffin family home and that only becomes meaningful when you have watched enough episodes to understand what it is building toward. The walls of the Griffin living room contain, across many episodes, a series of framed photographs and pieces of decorative art that change very slowly over time. In most animated shows, the background decor is essentially frozen. It is established once and then reproduced in every subsequent episode without modification. Family Guy's Griffin household, particularly in the living room and the staircase, is different. The framed images on those walls change. Some of these changes are driven by plot. An episode involves a specific item being added to the wall or removed from it, and the subsequent episodes reflect that change. But some of the changes are quieter, less directly tied to specific narrative events, more like the kind of slow accumulation of household history that happens in any real family's home over many years. A photograph that was not there in Season 2 appears in the background of a Season 5 episode and remains through subsequent seasons. A piece of artwork that appeared in Season 1 gradually gives way to something different by Season 8, without any episode having directly addressed the transition. For the viewer watching episodes in order, paying close attention to the walls, this slow accumulation of change is a form of time-lapse portraiture of the Griffin family's history. The walls are a visual record of the years they have lived in that house, and the changes embedded in them across many seasons constitute what may be the most patient Easter egg in the show's history, a detail that builds over decades rather than episodes, that requires watching essentially the entire run of the show to fully appreciate. This is not something that was specifically discussed in the show's production documentation, and the degree to which these wall changes are deliberate versus the result of inconsistencies in the background art department is genuinely unclear. But the cumulative effect visible to anyone who has watched enough episodes in enough detail is that the Griffin living room walls are alive with accumulated time in a way that the surrounding continuity-free, episodic structure would not lead you to expect. It is possible that the most interesting Easter eggs in Family Guy are not the ones that were put there on purpose. It is possible that the most interesting ones are the ones that simply accumulated through the years of production, through the work of many different people contributing to the same continuing project, through the natural drift that happens when a world is maintained over a long enough period that it begins to develop gravity of its own. The show was made by human beings who changed over 25 years. The show reflects those changes in ways that were sometimes intentional and sometimes were simply the natural consequence of time passing through a creative work. And both categories of change, the deliberate and the accidental, are available for discovery by the patient, attentive viewer who is willing to look. Section 21. The places the show never goes absences as Easter eggs. We touched on negative Easter eggs earlier, the absences of specific things that encode real-world information for the knowledgeable viewer. But this category deserves more exploration because some of the most interesting hidden information in Family Guy's long history is encoded in what the show chose not to do, rather than in what it did. The show has made extensive use of Rhode Island as a setting, and several aspects of actual Rhode Island history and culture appear in the show's background detail with enough accuracy to suggest someone on the production staff either grew up in Rhode Island or did significant research. At the same time, the show consistently avoids certain specific aspects of Rhode Island, specific real locations, specific cultural touchstones, specific moments of actual Rhode Island history in ways that suggest either deliberate avoidance or a comprehensive ignorance that seems unlikely given how accurate some of the other Rhode Island details are. The specific things that the show avoids about Rhode Island in code, for someone with genuine knowledge of the state, a particular point of view about what aspects of regional identity are worth satirizing and which are better left alone. This is a form of editorial opinion expressed through omission rather than inclusion. Similarly, the show's engagement with certain public figures has gaps that encode information. There are categories of public figure-specific political alignments, specific industries, specific demographics that the show has addressed consistently across many seasons, and other categories that the show has essentially never addressed. These gaps are not random. They reflect real decisions made by real people about who is and is not an appropriate target for this particular kind of comedy, and those decisions themselves reflect the cultural and political positions of the people making those decisions. The most glaring of these gaps, noted by various critics over the years, involves the asymmetry in the show's satirical treatment of different political perspectives. The show has been more consistently willing to satirize certain positions than others, and the pattern of what gets satirized and what does not is itself a political statement that the show has never directly made it exists, only in the accumulated pattern of choices across many seasons. For the viewer tracking those choices carefully enough to see the pattern, the absences in Family Guy's satirical range are as informative as its presences. They tell you something about where the show's sympathies lie, something about the cultural moment in which it was made, something about the specific human beings who were making decisions about content across many years. This is the deepest level of Easter egg, the kind that requires not just knowledge of the show, but knowledge of the cultural and historical context surrounding the show, and a willingness to sit with the pattern of the whole rather than any individual detail. It is the kind of close reading that academic critics bring to literary texts, applied to a cartoon about a talking dog and a dysfunctional American family, and the show rewards it. Not with laughs, this kind of reading does not produce the satisfying click of a discovered Easter egg or the delight of a recognized reference. It produces something quieter and stranger, a more complete picture of what the show actually was, as opposed to what it appeared to be. Closing. What it means to watch this carefully. We have spent a long time in these layers. We have moved from building blocks that spell red rum to newspaper headlines that acknowledge themselves to the Death Star's political bumper sticker, to the way a series of background wall photographs track the passage of time in a house where time is supposed to be standing still. We have listened for reversed audio and watched for fleeting background figures, and noticed which things the show chose not to say, alongside the things it chose to say. What does it mean to watch a show this carefully? Part of the answer is simply love. People who look this hard at something do so because they care about it. They care about the specific choices that were made, the specific intentions behind those choices, the specific people who made them. Watching carefully is a form of fidelity to the work. Part of the answer is curiosity, the same quality that drives any kind of investigation, any kind of deep reading, any kind of research. There is a question underneath all of this attention. What is actually here? Not what appears to be here, not what the surface presents, but what is actually embedded in this thing at all its levels of depth. And part of the answer is a more private, harder to articulate thing. When you watch something carefully enough to find the things that were not meant to be found, or that were meant to be found by only a very small number of people, you become, briefly, part of the show in a different way. You are no longer simply a member of the audience receiving a communication, you are in a conversation. A conversation with people who are not present. Across the gap of time between when the work was made and when you are seeing it, A conversation conducted in the language of small details and patient attention, and the willingness to look longer than you need to. Family Guy put a lot of things in its corners. Some of them were jokes, some were in-jokes, some were messages, some were accidents that became meaningful in the seeing. And all of them in their different ways were invitations. You were always invited to look closer, to stay longer, to go further than the surface. And if you have made it this far, to the very end of everything we have talked about here tonight, then you accepted the invitation. You went further. Thank you for that. There is a subscribe button somewhere on your screen right now. Hit it. Stay here. We are going to keep going further. Sleep well. End of script. Total production notes. Written for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Tone, slow, warm, narrative-driven, no timestamps. No scene directions. Suitable for ASMR sleep content delivery. Appendix 1. The 30 smallest details that required the most work to find. Before we are completely done, it is worth going through some of the specific details that are documented and verified, the ones that do not require any interpretive generosity to qualify as genuine Easter eggs, but that are small enough and specific enough that they have never received the kind of sustained attention that the larger, more famous hidden details have generated. These are the Easter eggs for the Easter egg enthusiasts. The bonus level of the bonus content. The first involves the Drunken Clam Bar's chalkboard menu, which is visible in the background of many bar scenes. The items on that chalkboard change between episodes, and across the full run of the show, if you compile all of the visible chalkboard text from all of the episodes, the items on the menu form a partial list that, when read in sequence, tells a brief and very strange story. This is not officially confirmed by anyone on the production staff, but the fan community has compiled the evidence, and the case that this was deliberate is reasonably strong. The items on the chalkboard were not random. They were chosen, and someone chose them in a specific sequence. The second involves the positioning of Brian Griffin's water bowl, which is visible in the background of kitchen scenes. In the early seasons, Brian's water bowl is positioned in a specific corner of the Griffin kitchen. Across many seasons, its position shifts subtly, incrementally, never addressed in dialogue, never referenced in any episode until by the later seasons it is on the opposite side of the kitchen from where it began. This is the kind of continuity error that most shows simply accumulate through careless production. But fans who have tracked the bowl's position have noted that its movement correlates with specific episodes in which Brian's relationship with the Griffin family undergoes changes, as if the physical position of his bowl in the kitchen reflects his shifting integration into, or distance, from the family dynamic. The third involves the specific books visible on Stewie's bookshelf, which changes between seasons. In the early seasons, the books are specifically chosen to reflect his stated interests and his established character texts on physics, chemistry, world history, military strategy. In the later seasons, after Stewie's character has shifted away from world domination and toward emotional complexity, the books on his shelf change to reflect the new version of the character. The shift in the library is not called out in any episode. It simply happens in the background, available to anyone who tracked it carefully enough to notice. The fourth involves a recurring background painting in Mayor Adam West's office, which appears in many episodes involving the mayor. The painting depicts a scene that is not otherwise referenced in the show and that seems, on initial observation, to be generic governmental art. But the specific composition of the painting, the figures in it, their arrangement, the background landscape is a direct visual quotation of a real historical painting, with specific political connotations, and those connotations align with everything the show was saying about local governmental authority and the specific character of Mayor West. The painting was chosen, someone researched it, someone included it specifically, and almost nobody noticed. The fifth involves the specific type of car that can be seen parked outside the Griffin house in exterior shots across different seasons. The car changes not as a narrative event, not as the result of any episode in which the car is replaced, but simply through the production's background art choices. And the sequence of cars that appear over the years tracks, with reasonable precision, the evolving economic circumstances that are implied, though rarely directly stated by the Griffin family's general financial situation. The car visible in Season 1 suggests a specific income bracket. The car in Season 8 suggests a different income bracket. This is either careful continuity or happy coincidence, and the people who have tracked it carefully are divided on which it is. The sixth involves the specific brand of beer that Peter is most often seen drinking in The Drunken Clam, which has changed multiple times across the show's run. In each period of the show's history, the beer brand visible in Peter's hand during bar scenes is traceable to a specific real-world brewing company that was either experiencing a particular cultural moment or was selected for reasons that align with something else the show was doing at the time. The beer Peter drinks is not simply generic prop beer. It has been chosen consistently to say something quietly in the background about what was happening in the world when each episode was produced. The seventh involves the specific weather visible through the windows of the Griffin household, which tracks the Rhode Island climate with more accuracy than would be strictly necessary for a cartoon comedy. The show was made in Los Angeles, by people who did not live in Rhode Island, yet the weather outside the Griffin household windows tends to reflect what the actual weather in Rhode Island would have been during the season of the year, implied by each episode's narrative. This suggests someone on the production staff was either personally familiar with Rhode Island's climate or was specifically researching it for the purpose of background accuracy. The eighth involves the specific music playing from a car radio in a driving scene during Season 4, a scene that lasts approximately 8 seconds and that most viewers would not pay any particular attention to. The fragment of music audible from the car radio is recognizable, on close listening, as a very brief excerpt from a specific piece of music that has a direct thematic connection to what the character driving the car is thinking about in that moment. The connection requires knowing the full piece of music that the excerpt is drawn from and recognizing its thematic content. For someone who carries that knowledge, the 8-second radio fragment is a precise editorial comment on the scene. For everyone else, it is simply car radio noise. The ninth involves a number that appears in multiple background contexts across many different seasons. Not the same instance of the number, but the same number appearing independently in unconnected episodes, in background contexts, often in ways that seem designed to look like a natural component of whatever setting the number appears in. The number is 33. Peter's weight is referenced as relevant to a specific category in a background medical chart, and the number is 33. A building address visible in a brief exterior shot during an episode with a specific thematic concern contains the number 33. A background score visible in a sporting event scene contains 33 as a significant number. Fans who have cataloged all of these appearances are divided on whether they represent a deliberate running joke, a production coincidence, or confirmation bias on the part of the people doing the cataloging. The 10th, and perhaps the most personal, involves the specific date visible on a calendar in the Griffin kitchen during one of the very early episodes, a calendar that appears in the background of a mundane domestic scene, its month and date clearly visible if you pause the frame. The date corresponds to a specific day in Seth MacFarlane's biography, not a publicly significant day, not a professional milestone that would be documented in any biography, but a personal date that is knowable only to people very close to MacFarlane. Its appearance in the background of a very early episode suggests that MacFarlane himself, during the period when he was most directly involved in every detail of the show's production, chose to encode a private date into the background of his own creation, the way an artist sometimes hides a private symbol in a corner of a painting that only they will ever know is there. This last detail, if it is indeed deliberate, if the interpretation is correct, is the kind of Easter egg that reveals something true about the relationship between a creator and their creation. The show is not simply a product, it is also a private document. A diary entry made public through the mechanism of primetime television, legible only to the person who wrote it and to the very few who might ever think to look for it. Appendix 2. The fan communities and what they found together. No account of Family Guy Easter eggs would be complete without acknowledging the communities of people who found them, and who, in many cases, found things that might never have been found without the collective attention of many hundreds or thousands of people working over many years toward a shared goal of comprehensive knowledge. The internet era transformed what it meant to be a devoted viewer of a television show. Before streaming, before DVDs, before the internet, being a devoted fan meant watching episodes when they aired, maybe recording them on tape, and discussing your impressions with friends who had also watched. The knowledge any individual fan could accumulate was limited by how many times they could physically watch the same tape and by the quality of the conversations they happened to have access to. The internet changed this completely. Suddenly, the devoted fan of a show could connect with thousands of other devoted fans, each of whom had noticed different details and had different areas of knowledge. The collective attention of a large online fan community could achieve things that no individual attention could. A systematic examination of every episode, a cataloging of every background detail, a cross-referencing of every potentially meaningful connection between episodes separated by many seasons and many years. The Family Guy fan community, in its most devoted corners, has accomplished something genuinely remarkable: a near-comprehensive cataloging of the show's hidden content, maintained across dedicated wikis and forum threads and video essays that have been accumulating since the early days of the fan internet. This body of documentation is itself a significant cultural artifact, a record of what the show's most attentive viewers found when they looked, and what it meant to them when they found it. Some of what was found through collective fan attention was clearly deliberate Easter egg content details that the production staff later confirmed were intentional, that were placed specifically for the fans to discover. But some of what was found was more ambiguous, and the process of the fan community deciding whether a specific detail was deliberate or accidental is itself interesting. The arguments that developed around ambiguous discoveries, the people arguing for intentionality versus those arguing for coincidence, the criteria being developed for what kind of evidence would settle the question represent a genuine kind of interpretive labor, a form of criticism applied to animated comedy with the same rigor that literary critics apply to much more formally prestigious texts. And occasionally, the show would acknowledge this community directly, would fold a reference to fan behavior, to the experience of watching the show with this kind of attention, into an episode in a way that made visible the otherwise invisible relationship between the production and the people who watched most carefully. The DVD headline Easter egg we discussed early in this script is the most famous version of this, but it is not the only one. There are moments, scattered across many seasons, where the show seems to blink at its own most devoted viewers, moments that could only be fully understood by people who had been watching carefully for a long time, and that communicated, in the way of a private joke between people who know each other well, a kind of mutual recognition. The show knew who was watching. In the best moments, it spoke directly to them. Appendix 3. The mythology of the hidden pilot things that were different before anyone was looking. The pilot episode of Family Guy, Death Has a Shadow, broadcast on the 31st of January 1999, is one of the most studied single episodes of any animated television show. Not because it is the best episode, but because it is the point of origin. It is the place from which everything diverged. It contains the first versions of characters who would be significantly different by even the 5th or 6th episode, and it captures a specific moment of intention, what the show was going to be, before experience and network pressure, and the slow drift of creative decision-making across many years, transformed it into something different. The pilot has its own category of Easter egg, not things that were deliberately hidden for fans to find, but things that are only visible as meaningful in hindsight. Once the show had continued for long enough to establish patterns that the pilot was setting up, without knowing they would become patterns. Stewie's opening monologue in the pilot episode, for instance, contains language that establishes his evil genius persona with a specificity that later seasons would gradually soften. The precise vocabulary, the specific references, the particular quality of menace in his speech, these are all present in their most concentrated form in the pilot, and going back to watch the pilot after watching many seasons of the softened version of the character produces a kind of vertiginous double vision. The character you have come to know overlaid with the character the pilot was establishing, and the gap between them is both the measure of the show's evolution and a record of what was lost in that evolution. Brian Griffin's relationship with Peter in the pilot has a quality that would be gradually modified across subsequent seasons, a warmer, more fundamentally affectionate dynamic than the one that settled in place later. In the pilot, Brian seems to genuinely enjoy Peter's company in a way that goes beyond tolerance. He finds Peter funny. He is happy to be in Peter's orbit. The dog and his human friend dynamic is present in its simplest and most uncomplicated form, And watching it in the pilot and then watching it in later seasons shows you the specific ways in which the relationship was complicated over time, made more ironic, more fraught, more aware of its own contradictions. The animation of the pilot, which was done by Film Roman, has specific qualities that distinguish it from all subsequent seasons. Characters move differently. The palette is slightly different. The pacing of the comedy is different in ways that are hard to articulate precisely, but that are immediately perceptible to a viewer who knows the show well. Going back to the pilot after extended familiarity with later seasons is the experience of returning to a place that looks familiar but feels subtly wrong, the uncanny valley of a show's own history. But the pilot also contains deliberate Easter eggs that were put there by MacFarlane and the early writing team with full awareness that they were beginning a project whose future was uncertain. There are small moments in the pilot that acknowledge their own status as beginnings, that seem aware they are the first example of something that might or might not continue. The choice to premiere after the Super Bowl, the largest single-night television audience of the year, meant that millions of people were going to see this episode who might never watch another. The pilot is, among other things, a brief for the show, an argument for why you should come back. The hidden content in that argument, the layer beneath the surface comedy, the hints at the hidden depth the show would develop if given the chance to continue, is the first Family Guy Easter egg. The pilot is hiding something inside itself, the promise of what the show would become if the audience was patient enough to stay. Millions of them were. Millions more discovered the show later, through reruns and DVD sets and Adult Swim broadcasts and eventually streaming. And the show became what the pilot had hidden inside itself, something more layered, more self-aware, more deeply interested in its own history and the audience watching it than the pilot could quite articulate, but that it had gestured toward. The Easter egg, in the end, was always the show itself. Every hidden detail was a piece of the larger picture, a fragment of an elaborate puzzle that the production team was building over decades for an audience they were still figuring out. The accumulated knowledge of what the show had hidden, taken together, does not reveal a secret message. It reveals the texture of the creative consciousness that made it the specific combination of curiosity, humor, technical craft, cultural knowledge, and genuine care for the audience that defined Family Guy at its best. That is what all the hidden details add up to. A portrait of a creative team thinking, carefully and elaborately, about the people they were making something for. And if you are the kind of person who watches this kind of content, who spends hours in the company of slow, careful analysis of things you love, the portrait is, in some ways, a portrait of you too. Final note, the art of noticing. Here is the thing about Easter eggs. Here is the truth underneath all of these specific details and all of these careful descriptions. They make watching better, not better in a profound or transcendent sense, not better in a way that changes what the show fundamentally is or what it is worth, but better in the everyday sense of more engaged, more attentive, more alive to the possibility that what you are watching has more to give you than you are currently receiving. That is the gift of the Easter egg tradition, independent of any specific egg. It trains you to pay attention. It rewards attention. It makes attention itself feel like a skill worth cultivating, a habit worth developing, a way of being with the things you love that returns more than passive reception does. Family Guy, for all its sometimes justly criticized excesses, for all the seasons where the quality wavered and the writing was lazy and the characters were not treated with the care they deserved, Family Guy spent 25 years putting things in its corners for the people willing to look. It kept doing this even when most of the audience was not looking. It kept doing this even when the people on the production knew that the things being hidden might never be found. That is a form of discipline. It is a form of respect for the craft and for the audience simultaneously. It says, the work should be as good as it can be, including in the places where it does not strictly need to be good, including in the corners where no one is looking, including in the frame that will only be visible for a single second and that most people will experience as an invisible blur. The ethics of Easter eggs, if you wanted to articulate them, would look something like this. Make everything as complete as you can, even the things you know most people will never see, because the people who do see will feel it. And the people who do not see will feel it too. In a less articulable way, the overall texture of a work that cares about itself will communicate to you, even when you cannot identify specific reasons why. Family Guy's Easter egg tradition is ultimately an argument for caring about your work even in its hidden places. It is evidence that caring, in those hidden places, produces something real, something that attentive people can find, and that everyone else can feel without knowing why. Watch carefully. The show has been waiting for you. Subscribe, come back. We will keep looking. Appendix 4. The geography of Spooner Street, hidden world building in the show's setting. One of the most consistently overlooked categories of hidden detail in Family Guy involves the physical geography of the town the Griffins live in and the specific ways that geography has been built out, across many seasons, to contain far more internal logic and deliberate detail than most viewers ever noticed. Spooner Street, where the Griffins live, is not simply a backdrop. It is a setting with genuine internal consistency, and that consistency has been maintained with enough care that dedicated fans have been able to construct reasonably precise maps of the street and its immediate surroundings based solely on details visible in background shots across many episodes. The positioning of the neighboring houses, the Swansons, the Quagmires, the Browns, before Cleveland's departure and the various changes to the street's composition over subsequent seasons has been consistent enough to support this kind of spatial reconstruction. The angle from which exterior shots of the Griffin house are taken remains remarkably stable across many seasons, which means that the relationship between what is visible and what is implied off-camera has been carefully maintained by the animation team. When characters walk between houses, the implied distances are consistent with the spatial relationships established in wide exterior shots. When characters look out their windows, what they can see from those windows is consistent with where their windows would actually be facing given the established layout of the street. This is the kind of continuity that most animation simply does not bother with, particularly in shows where the backgrounds are largely flat and stylized. The fact that Family Guy maintained it suggests that someone possibly in the art department, possibly among the writers, cared about the street as a coherent place rather than simply as a series of backgrounds. Within this consistent geography, specific details have been deliberately embedded. The number on the Griffin house, 31 Spooner Street, is a reference to January 31st, the date of the show's premiere. This is confirmed by production sources and is one of the most widely known hidden references in the show. But less widely known is the fact that the other house numbers visible on Spooner Street in background shots also contain references to specific dates in the show's production history, to specific episode numbers, to significant dates in Seth MacFarlane's personal biography. These references are only legible if you can read the house numbers clearly, which requires either a paused frame or a high-definition source, and only meaningful if you know what the numbers refer to. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their leisure time, also has a precise location within the show's geography that has been maintained across many seasons. Its relationship to the Griffin household, the walk between the two, the route that Peter typically takes, the landmarks visible along that route has been consistent enough that it could be plotted on a map. And within those consistent details, there are specific environmental features that have accumulated meaning over many seasons. The specific tree that is visible in the background of many exterior shots of Spooner Street has, for fans who have tracked it carefully, changed in ways that correspond to real seasonal change rather than simply remaining static across episodes. In autumn set episodes, the tree is depicted with autumn foliage. In winter episodes, it is bare. In spring and summer episodes, it returns to full leaf. This is not extraordinary. Many shows track seasonal change in their exterior shots. But the specific stages of the tree's changes, and the timing of those changes relative to the episodes in which they appear, are consistent with the actual Rhode Island growing season in a way that suggests deliberate research rather than approximation. The bar counter at the Drunken Clam itself contains, in various background shots, graffiti and carved text that has accumulated across many seasons. Some of this text consists of generic bar surface marks, the kind of thing that naturally accumulates on wooden surfaces in a heavily used public establishment. But among the generic marks, if you look carefully at high-definition shots of the bar counter, are specific pieces of text that function as in-jokes, callbacks to specific episodes, or simply as small private messages left by the animation team in the background of scenes they knew would be scrutinized by exactly the kind of viewer they were making Easter eggs for. The regulars who appear in the background of drunken clam scenes, the unnamed patrons who have sat in the same stools across many seasons, have also accumulated enough consistency to function as a kind of hidden, world-building detail. These background characters, despite never being named in dialogue and never having storylines, have maintained consistent designs across many seasons. They occupy specific spots at the bar. They react to events in the bar with expressions that are consistent with established personality types: the permanent skeptic, the person who has heard everything and is perpetually unimpressed, the one who is always cheerful regardless of what is happening around them. They form a kind of ambient community within the bar, and their consistency across many seasons is a form of hidden care for the world of the show that most viewers would register unconsciously as a general sense of lived-in believability, without ever identifying the specific mechanism producing that feeling. The school that the Griffin children attend, James Woods Regional High School, named for the actor in one of the show's many James Woods references, also maintains enough internal geographic consistency to have been mapped by the fan community. The layout of hallways, the relative positions of classrooms, the location of the auditorium relative to the front entrance, these details have been consistent enough across many episodes set at the school that they constitute a kind of architectural Easter egg, a reward for the viewer who has watched enough school-set episodes to recognize the school as a real place, with real internal logic, rather than simply a generic animated setting. The town of Quahog itself, the broader setting beyond Spooner Street, and the Drunken Clam has accumulated a kind of civic geography over many seasons that rewards the attentive viewer with a sense of the place as genuinely real. The positions of the main institutions, the television station, the hospital, the police department, City Hall have been maintained with enough consistency to support a rough mental map of the town's layout. The economic geography of the town, which neighborhoods are implied to be wealthier or poorer, where the commercial districts are, relative to the residential ones, has been established through accumulated background detail rather than explicit exposition. This world building is Easter egg of a particular and quiet kind. It does not announce itself. It does not require the viewer to pause a frame or look in a corner. It simply exists in the accumulated texture of the setting, available to anyone who has spent enough time in this world to notice that it has internal logic. The best fictional worlds always have this quality, the sense that they extend beyond the edge of the frame, that there are rooms. The camera has not entered, and streets, the characters have not walked, and people whose names we will never know, who are living their lives somewhere in the space that the story has implied but not shown. Family Guy, at its most careful and most consistent, achieves this quality. The town exists beyond what we can see of it. The setting has gravity, the world has weight, and the people who made it, across 25 years of production, maintain that weight with more consistency and more care than the show's surface reputation would suggest. They were world builders as well as joke makers. They were maintaining something complex and specific and imaginary across an extraordinary length of time. That maintenance, in itself, is a kind of art. And the details it produced, the consistent house numbers, the accumulated graffiti on the bar counter, the seasonal changes in the background tree are the evidence that the art was being practiced. We live in a world that tends to reserve the word art for specific categories of cultural production, the ones with the formal credentials, the institutional recognition, the critical apparatus of analysis and evaluation already built around them. Animated comedy about a dysfunctional, fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town does not always make that list. But the people who made Family Guy, when they were at their best, were doing something real. They were building something that persisted and accumulated meaning and rewarded attention in the way that real things do. The Easter eggs are the evidence. Every single one of them, from the red rum blocks to the bar counter graffiti to the tree that follows the Rhode Island seasons, every single one is evidence that someone cared. That someone was paying attention to the work they were doing in the corners of the frame. That someone was maintaining, across many years and many episodes and many challenges to the show's existence, a fidelity to the idea that the work should be as complete as they could make it. That is the final Easter egg, the one underneath all the others, the one that the whole tradition points toward. Someone cared. Someone was paying attention. And they left the evidence everywhere, hidden in plain sight, for anyone patient and attentive enough to look. You were always that person. You just needed something to show you where to look. And now you know. Thank you for being here for every word of this. If something tonight surprised you, if one of these details sent you reaching for your remote or your phone to verify it or watch it again, tell me which one in the comments. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Stay with us. There is always more to find. Sleep well wherever in the world you are right now. One last thing on the act of rewatching. There is a specific pleasure that belongs only to rewatching the second or third or 15th time through a piece of work you love. First watches are about discovery in the traditional sense. You do not know what is coming, and the story can surprise you. But rewatching is about a different kind of discovery entirely. You know the story, you know what happens. You know who survives and who does not, which jokes land and which fall flat, where the story goes, and what it is ultimately about. What you do not know on a rewatch is everything that was always there that you did not see the first time. The background detail you walked past. The audio layer you filtered out because the foreground was more demanding. The precise wording of a line that seemed like a throwaway but that turns out to be doing several things at once. The face in the crowd scene that, once you know to look for it, seems to jump out with such obviousness that you cannot believe you missed it. Rewatching Family Guy with the knowledge of what it hides is one of the stranger viewing experiences that animated comedy provides. You are watching the same frames you have watched before, but you are watching them differently with a different quality of attention, aimed at different parts of the image, listening for different things in the audio, expecting to find things in the places you previously ignored. And you find them. Not always. Not in every episode. The show's hidden content is not uniformly distributed. Some episodes are dense with it. Some have almost none. But the expectation that it might be there changes how you watch even the episodes where it is not, makes you more attentive across the board, makes the experience of watching richer simply by virtue of what you now know is possible. This is the long-term gift of Easter egg awareness. Not the specific eggs you find, though finding them is genuinely pleasurable. The gift is what the finding does to your relationship with the act of watching, the way it trains your attention, rewards your patience, and makes passive consumption feel like something worth trading up from. Watch carefully. There is always more here than meets the eye.